Yo, Atlas speaking, and welcome to the Atlasfanfic channel. Today I'm here with What If I Was Reborn in Naruto as Danzo Shimura. Basically, a Naruto fan finds himself reincarnated into the Naruto verse and the beginnings of the most hated Naruto character of all time. Characters yet to be legends or even born yet are at the mercy of this Naruto fan and his decisions. But to even survive in the ninja world you need strength. And he plans on getting it. Also, with all the knowledge of Naruto in his mind, how will his existence and choices change the Naruto story? Find out now. I won't bore you and make this intro any longer. Let the tale begin. Chapter 1, Prologue, Little Shadow Under the Leaf. Reincarnation is not something I was a strong believer up until I was subjected to it. It sounds odd that someone can actually say that it is a thing, especially when said phenomenon is preceded by something that should be ultimately the end of everything. Death takes, and it never gives anything in return. But much to my immense surprise, when I realized that I had somehow breathed my last whisper, I realized that the darkness that was supposed to lead me into the nothingness was actually a temporary one. The kind of temporary that I best knew as a mere night of sleep. In fact, I blinked awake in a quiet manner and I found myself staring at a ceiling that wasn't familiar. I blinked various times, my brain failing to grasp at the situation at hand during these first few moments here in this different place. This wasn't home, nor it was a hospital. I could barely see around as the window had been left mostly closed, allowing just a small line of light to cut through the shadows surrounding me. Blinking one last time, I finally realized that this room wasn't just unfamiliar, but also familiar. The style gave away that this was the standard Japanese room. I was resting by the floor. No, it was a futon. A thin layer of soft mattress that separated me from actually touching the cold and unforgiving floor, while offering me a degree of warmth and tightness. And it just reminded me of unpleasant times I had to rest out of home, either for work or other affairs. My calm had melted away at the incessant poking from my confusion and uneasiness over the unexpected sight around me. I ruled out the chances of kidnapping. It wouldn't make any sense if I was just taken by some Japanese gangs. Why? I wasn't even close to the zones that these people were known to operate to. It just wouldn't make any sense to make this much of an effort to bring me comfort, especially if this was a case of kidnapping. The real hint that shoved away any normal reasoning was the fact that I was tiny. I was small. Smaller than I was supposed to be. Staring for a little while at my tiny and childish arms, I finally took a moment to reach out for my hair. A little spiky, terribly unruly. The classing sleep hair was there to bring me minor annoyance. It was going to be troublesome to get a decent appearance out of it. My panic had simmered down to nothing now that I had thrown away any dangerous circumstances. There was just a sense of peace in this moment that urged me to keep quiet as I continued to study my current situation. A sigh left my lips, starting to get irked at the lack of proper illumination in this room. But just as I pondered if I should have or not moved to check on the rest of the house, my attention was swiftly stolen away from myself and right to the only door I could see. It slid open, revealing a tired but smiling face. A woman. Her long dark hair was combed in a short ponytail that rested by her shoulder. I resisted the urge to grimace at the prominent hint that this lady was possibly going to die, considering how many mothers had perished with that hairstyle. "Good morning," the stranger greeted with an unexpected amount of warmth and familiarity. I was stunned at first, unable to answer as I tried to properly assess the current situation. Who is she? My new mother? My aunt? Maybe a very old big sister? I really hope the latter option wasn't the truth. I don't need to face the era just yet. Or ever. I really don't like the prospect of facing the truest plight of a young boy in a Japanese-based setting. She blinked, surprised at my lack of response, but then her smile widened a little bit. "I suppose you truly tired yourself out by thinking about today," the lady hummed with a nod. but I hope you're ready for your first day at the academy. The Hokage will be there to see if you're all awake and prepared for this experience. 2 things. Academy and Hokage. Both yanked me right into the belief this was in fact Naruto. The second term just confirmed this to be the truth. I was confused by how, why, and when this displacement/reincarnation/shift happened, but I didn't have neither the time nor the mental capacity to genuinely brainstorm. The only things I could say now was that I was in the same world which saw Naruto happen and I was a student to the Ninja Academy. I just woke up and found myself already tied up to a deadly career path. Why do I feel that things hadn't changed much from the previous life? I mean, death isn't that much of a variable in the workplace, but technically speaking, I was still going to be subjected to route I couldn't stray away from. Despite my inner uneasiness, I managed to nod instead of keeping up with the silence. I was still unsure if this was a mother or an aunt, but I found myself leaning more to the mother option. I'm awake, I replied slowly, giving one last analytical thought over the way I was supposed to be addressing the woman in front of me. Okay-san. Her smile twitched mirthfully at that response. I'm glad that you are, she commented back. But I think you shouldn't waste more time by the bed. Breakfast is already by the table, and your Otusan wouldn't want you to be late for your first day. I saw her entire frame sag a little at the mentioning of her husband. I didn't need to be told directly to suspect that my new father was dead. That's saddening, but not to the point of tears. I don't even know my name, how was I supposed to sympathize over such a detail? It would have been hypocritical to grieve over an unknown man's death, because it wasn't a burden to consider as mine. Instead of speaking, I just stood up and walked up to the woman. Her sadness was hidden by a faux effort to show happiness over my presence. If I had been a child, that would have been effective, but I wasn't one. Or at least, I wasn't one mentally. I reached for her left hand, urging her to stand up from her crouched position. Otusan wouldn't want you to weep for him, I stated calmly, and my childlike tone was finally clear to me. But my eyes were on my mother and she seemed to freeze at my comment. She teared up a little bit, but she nodded, standing up and starting to lead me through the halls of the modest-sized compound. And while I waited for other hints pop up before my eyes and offer me a clear sight over the specific part of the timeline I was, the woman decided to reward my fortitude with a brighter smile and a revealing comment. If only he could see you now, Danzo-kun. But as the lady kept on with a happy outlook even when we reached our destination and started to eat breakfast, I felt something crash within my mind. Of all things I would have expected from this BS degree reincarnation, replacing the child form of Danzo Shimura wasn't in my list. And boy, this was going to be a wild ride for sure. Konoha no Sato was far from the urban settlement that was going to become in a couple of decades from now. The place was actually a big village with just various compounds and buildings. Just a handful of shops spread all over the place, and no pseudo-modern organizations occupying a slice of the available land. A single element remained unchanged in this very unexpected displacement was Konoha's own ninja academy. It was a novelty for this era, as the warring states had just ended, and people were still grasping at the innovative mind created by the combined efforts of the Senju brothers, Madara Uchiha, and Mito Uzumaki. Kind of surprising to hear from my own mother how the last member was equally commended as the other three. It reminded me of the fact that Hashirama's wife had yet to become the first Jinchuriki to the Kyuubi, and that there was no reason to cover her image from any kidnapping attempts. I glanced at the chance as something to further help me gain a better standing in this world. If I had been reincarnated in the original timeline, even as a kid with less chances than Naruto to becoming a genin early on in the show, I would have probably taken a slower and safer route. But right now that I was growing to become one of the soldiers for the first Shinobi War, I had to milk everything that could be milked for new techniques, body and chakra improvement, and higher hopes of surviving the first 2 conflicts. The third war could be winged with me chilling by the home front. But that was if I managed to live to that point. Plus I had no intentions of becoming an actual cripple. I really didn't need to become half mummy for the sake of canon. Fuck canon, I was going to mess up with the plotline so hard that not even its mother was going to recognize it. With that mindset already ingrained in my next moves, I proceeded to attain a proper and peaceful outlook to appear as genuine as possible. The woman that was eagerly leading me around, my new mother, didn't seem to find anything worth of pointing out over my performance. Either I was visualizing little Danzo's personality flawlessly, or she was just basking over the mature comments I had thrown her way. Nothing strange, but just some pure and innocent praises that were meant to give her a better look over life. I wasn't a psychologist, but I could recognize depression perfectly when said depressed person would silently stare to a seamless spot of the table for a long time while she waited for me to be done by the bathroom. I swear she hadn't moved while I was busy with my simple routine, and I almost worried about a circumstance that could technically become a problem to me. If she killed herself, and the chances were pretty high considering how much she loved my father and grandfather, both shinobis that had died before the Shimura clan had joined the new village, then I was going to be left at the local orphanage. And while I didn't give that much weight at the accounts offered by a few flashbacks from Naruto's childhood and stories depicting physical abuse and or neglect over the orphans, I really didn't want to lose my big house. Kind of cruel to be picking up elements over my new family like this, focusing only on my betterment rather than preserving them out of mere kindness, but this world just wasn't going to allow me to have a happy ending. At least, not without murdering 3/4 of the current population. People were still fixed in warring despite the fact villages were becoming a reality. And I was expecting some greediness from those that wanted to fully control the bijus. Fuck, I need to make plans to kill Zetsu early on. I wasn't going to allow the bastard to live long enough to make any of the messes that this period should be experiencing. Especially Madara betraying the village. That was a mission with identical priority to surviving the dangers that were going to come my way. And I was really afraid to fail miserably right by the first step just as we were taken inside the large courtyard in front of the academy's building. Mom, like the other parents, had been kept away as the children were led to this large clearing. It was so surprising to be in this place, after seeing it in its anime version. There were 4 adults before us. 3 I could recognize as the Senju brothers, Hashirama and Tobirama, and Madara Uchiha. The 4th man was possibly the objective judge, since the 3 known ninjas were not looking quite friendly with one another. I expected the serious and no-nonsense Madara for this occasion, yet I was regaled with. The first student to pass the initiation test will be offered my personal teachings for a base katan technique. That. Madara, I thought we agreed to not give this much incentive. We don't need to create unneeded competition dash. The first student can choose either Uchiha-san's offer, or they can learn 2 base futon techniques under my guidance. Tobirama, don't start bickering with Madara. We can't do this in front of the kids. I noticed the unknown man standing a couple of meters away from the trio frown nervously at the scene, and I could see his need to intervene curbed by the logical reasoning that any attempt to defuse the situation would result in some damage on his person. Quite troublesome to know that some of the comedic elements of the series were there to create an unflattering introduction scene for the first Hokage, the future second, and Madara indestructible Uchiha. Is this normal? The child beside me blurted out without thinking too much about it. I've heard that they had been like this since they were children, I replied absent-mindedly, gaining the attention of the oddly familiar brunette. I suppose old habits are troublesome to kill. But the Hokage is dash. Still a man, I interjected for him. And one that can't get his younger brother to not be as unprofessional as his childhood friend. The boy snorted in amusement, and I was half glad that we were talking quiet enough to not get the adults' attentions on us. I didn't want to be subjected to a death glare from Madara himself. And I really didn't want to be subjected to a double death glare from him and Tobirama. That would be deadly enough to kill me on the spot with how weak I currently was. I'm Hiruzen, the child ultimately said, and I felt sweating at the odd circumstance presenting in front of me. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the man that was going to become the shinobi no kami and the third Hokage. I was supposed to be his malicious rival. Danzo had wanted the hat but was eventually screwed by a cowardly decision during the First Shinobi War. To think that this situation was happening so suddenly and so favorably. Holy fuck, is Kami herself looking out for me? Still, I offered a polite smile and nod. I'm Danzo. Nice to meet you, Hiruzen-kun. Our interaction was brief as the amusing but also awkward scene finally concluded with some lingering glares thrown from both parts. Today you will be taking a simple test to show those that are ready to be enlisted to the Ninja Academy. Each and every one of you will have to display some control over a particularly simple technique, one that will be first shown by Hokage Dano. Hashirama smiled as the unknown instructor pointed at him. The oldest of the Senju brothers started to slowly display various hand signs and then, a second Hashirama appeared right beside the first one. Bushin no Jutsu. I'm kind of surprised that this was going to be the test to enter the academy. I guess this just showed how much the academy was going to decline after just 4 decades of activity. You have up until lunchtime to get this technique down and working on an acceptable level to pass, the instructor resumed with a quick nod. You may start from now. I nodded myself, and I gave a quick glance to my newest friend. Hiruzen was smiling, and I was quite sure that he knew how to get the jutsu correctly thanks to some prior training with it. Still, I'm a kid, and I really wanted to get a flashy and destructive technique in my arsenal. So I pushed myself to remember the hand signs and closed my eyes. I wasn't sure if Danzo knew how to draw chakra this early in his life, but I knew a hint or two about how things were supposed to work. It was all based over some will-centered control over my reserved. The hand signs were meant to properly channel the energy in the technique I really wanted. So, after taking a deep breath and grasping at my innermost, I started to get the hand signs done. Tiger. Boar. Ox. Dog. I partly expected to fail the first time around, and while I knew that drawing chakra was much easier when one had a small reserve, I really didn't expect the pleasant results that beckoned me as I opened my eyes. Hiruzen had managed a success by getting 2 flawless clones out. But I had somehow gained attention by actually get 3 clones out. Those weren't as perfect as Hiruzen's as they all looked fairly winded. Almost sickly pale from a closer inspection. Yet it was enough to gather the attention of both Madara and Tobirama to the scene. The combined success got them interested, and I could see them both trying to decipher which one was actually the best to determine as the more successful. I glanced at Hiruzen, and the brunette glanced back at me. We shared an unsure but determined look. We were quiet, but we both had the same thought over the matter. Draw? I inquired quietly, getting a smile out of the fellow student. Draw. Hashirama was close enough to hear this simple understanding, smiling brightly as he pushed himself between the 2 rivaling adults. You heard the children. They are both first. We're the judges for that, Hashirama-Nizen, Tobirama pointed out with some annoyance. And I think a draw would just be a pointless result, Madara somewhat agreed. And you're both too slow to decide. I agree on the 2 boys' assessment, the first Hokage rebuked with a serious tone. And I think I'm not the only one accepting this. The unnamed instructor nodded in agreement at the taller brunette's fair reply, and soon Hashirama's attention was on us. But if we want to keep up with the competition, I guess the question now is, which one of you wishes to train with Madara-san, and who wishes to train with Tobirama-san? And that's where I think I put a foot in my mouth. While it would have been smarter to stick by the second Hokage as it was the safer way to learn more, I knew that Hiruzen would get mauled by someone like Madara. So, I concocted a devious idea to get him to pick the choice I wanted him to go for. Both offers are good, I muttered quietly. Uchiha-sama is offering a Katon technique, and Katon is known for firepower. Senju-sama is offering two futon techniques, and while the wind style doesn't offer the same power as katan, I think the flexibility with those make them match up evenly with the former. But you can pick one, child, Tobarama commented dryly. While I find your comment well described, I think you understand that we don't have all time to waste on your indecision. I shrugged. I suppose then, that I will have to pick Uchiha-sama's offer. The white-haired shinobi froze at that, while Madara actually smiled smugly at the little victory gained from this. Hashirama nodded, his smile twitching for a moment before he turned to look at the young Sarutobi. I suppose you will be fine to train under Tobarama-san. Hiruzen looked slightly uncertain about the situation, but then again he wasn't given a real choice. If both offers were good in terms of learning new things, then the breaking point was the unnerving presence that Madara exerted quite naturally. So I wasn't much surprised when he offered a quick nod. But while I was sure to have prevented a detrimental rivalry with the boy, I certainly sealed my fate for an arduous time with the one and only Madara Uchiha. The man was still smiling and it was a chilling sight for sure. I swear, I saw the girl occupying the space on my left actually started to cry before that vision. Hashirama, being the simple dolt at the time, quickly scolded his childhood friend and more bickering ensued. And while I made my first real step in this mad world, I couldn't help but think. How do I con my clones away from existence? Chapter 2, The Will, 1. I should have expected that life in Konoha a couple of years prior to the first Shinobi War was going to be terribly slow. It wasn't like I was annoyed by the fact that I wasn't put in a dangerous situation. In fact, I was enjoying that I had yet to be forced getting my first kill. War was going to happen eventually, but it was far enough for me to evaluate any chances of improvement available in Konoha, which meant training both at school and back home. The simple life of one of the first students at Konoha Academy ended up being fairly easier than anything shown in the manga, and it didn't occupy as many hours of the day as its future version would. The lack of many of the subjects that were in this time period labeled as civilian only meant that all ninja-based topics were expanded and prioritized with incredible scrutiny. Shurikenjutsu, Tainjutsu, Jinjutsu, and Ninjutsu. This last subject wasn't going to be taught until we were mature enough to handle the lessons. History was the only non-fighting related topic that was mostly left to families to explain to their children to dispense. The warring era was a bloody and confusing one, and nobody was yet capable of offering a full-fledged explanation of the various events that happened before and during the conclusion of these unpleasant years. I had the chance of speaking with my Okaya-san about the time when both Otusan and Ojiji-san were still alive and fighting bravely for our clan. The memories were painful to remember, and I could see the woman flinch more than once in her narration. But I knew that receiving positive inputs during these tales, especially now that I was tiny and adorable, would have avoided unpleasant circumstance with the lone parent. About this very matter, I had also seen to mention to the neighbors about the fact that my mother would get distracted while talking about my father. The implicit request would then result in various people, mostly fellow mothers and wives that had taken sympathy over my nervousness and my mother's depression, visiting and inviting Okaya-san while I was away either for school or for outdoor training. With that base covered temporarily, as I knew that things could be solved just by offering external support, I shifted my attention over the academy and its teachers. It's still odd to think that the more important classes were taught by the Senju brothers. The first Hokage was the man-child kind of guy that knew how to speak with the students and somewhat relate to them. He was rather experienced with kids, which was quite odd since he had yet to become a father. He was married, the union between him and Mito Uzumaki having happened just a few months before the formation of Konoha no Sato. Still, despite being one of the beloved teachers in the school, his presence was somewhat lacking most of the time. With Hashirama being busy with his tasks as the leader of the village, his younger sibling was given full control of the academy, and, with this much power under his belt, the guy created the basis of an educative system that will improve and prosper the more time passed and experience was gained over this project. It was good work that genuinely helped with the awkward state the school was in. Surprisingly enough, it was also one devoid of the biased opinion the man had with the Uchiha clan. Some of the students were part of that family, and I failed to see instances that made their lives difficult compared to their peers. Everyone, from civilian-born kids to the heirs to the clans, were treated with utmost equality and meritocracy. And that made me contemplate when things spiraled out of control and rendered this place of culture in a corrupt system to favor certain groups. 2 weeks went by swiftly and mostly uneventfully, with only a couple of unique circumstances genuinely bringing me to a grimace or even to outright fuming before certain people. Hiruzen proved to be a good friend, one that would accept my moments of venting in exchange of receiving my own ears when he needed to rant himself about his own troubles. It was unnerving how this degree of frustration had become a normality for both our lives, especially after we had accepted the rewards offered by the bickering leader trio. While the rewards promised counted 2 futon and a katan ninjutsu, the rivalry between Madara and Tobirama spawned an extended training schedule. I considered myself partly at fault for the circumstance, something I had never told to Hiruzen out of the fact that I wasn't sure how Tobirama was training him. I only knew that Madara was a massive bastard when he was teaching people. This very detail not only explained why Hashirama didn't trust his counterpart in teaching at the academy, but also why there was no canon apprentice known to have been taught by the clan leader. Obito counted more as an unwilling student that hardly learned something from the real deal and was conditioned by Zetsu. Still, the spark that escalated the simple reward in full training could be identified in a minor mistake I made while trying my best in learning the fire ninjutsu picked by Madara. The Great Fireball Jutsu was the first ability anyone that had an affinity with fire should be training with when starting elemental-based learning. Mastering the technique was also considered a test for any Uchiha shinobis and kunoichis to prove their worth as proud warriors of their clans. But I soon found the only day offered to learn the jutsu to be incredibly unfair on my part. I wasn't sure if Madara had seen to check if I had fire affinity, but I knew already from canon that Danzo's affinity was wind, with minor hints of earth and water. I wasn't supposed to get the ninjutsu going. In fact, I think I ended up surprising Madara himself when I ended up replicating this simple ninjutsu after 6 hours of continuous attempts. It was draining on my chakra coils, but the sizzling noise and the fiery explosion that ensued once the modest-sized fireball collided with the nearby trees was more than enough to leave me with a cheeky smile. I suppose I should explain how I, a 7-year-old Danzo Shimura, managed to make use of that powerful ninjutsu after so little. The key to my success was tied to 2 minor factors that not many children in my situation would have been able to make use under the pressure exerted by the Sharingan wielder. The first thing was that I knew the supposed effects the jutsu was supposed to cause to the user while preparing. The sensation of burning by the lungs, then by the throat, and finally by the lips. Fire had to be coaxed carefully during the complete process, as a simple mistake on this part would result in my concentration getting disrupted by the unpleasant sensation. I had to spend a couple of attempts just to get a grasp over the first step before proceeding to the next and last one. Spitting the fireball sounded quite easy to accomplish, and yet the issue that found me stuck for hours was that I couldn't get it to properly form out of my mouth. The sphere would just leave in a lengthy lick of fire that would swiftly reach my target without actually forming in a compact fireball. Despite my surprise at becoming a human flamethrower, the attempt was ignored by Madara as the man calmly exercised nearby with his gun by. It definitively didn't help my morale when the guy supposedly offering teaching was wasting time training on his own. I didn't even try to ask for any advice as I was unsure how the man would have taken my uneasy steps toward success. He was prideful all right, and I didn't need to get in his bad side considering the massive difference between him and me. Which meant I was left on my own to get this blasted ninjutsu cooked properly. And it worked, kind of. The fireball former with some quivering by the edges, as if it was ready to disperse in an explosive manner, but I managed to send it soaring right at my target and get it to destroy it. I waited for a few seconds, trying to normalize my breathing after the umpteenth itching enveloping my lungs at the fiery technique, and my first training session came to an end when Madara saw it fit to provide some emotional support in the form of a single rough head pat. To be honest, I almost yelped at the unexpected touch, expecting for my head to be squished for having messed up somewhere in the process. "You've done well. You may go now," the Uchiha clan leader commented curtly. And he left at that point. Confusion had swelled for just a handful of seconds before I decided to accept the dismissal and finally return back home. Okayasan was impressed by the fact I had gained Madara's attention, but the way she praised my good work seemed more of a chiding than else. Maybe the woman knew it herself that the Uchiha wasn't one to keep close by. And I knew that her common sense was correct by the time I was picked up at school by the man the very following day. There was no word spared, not even a greeting as Madara walked toward me as I followed the small group of students out of the academy and led me away from the path from home and right to the training grounds we had used the day before. Training ensued and, differently from the first lesson, the Uchiha actually gave attention to my progress. Taijutsu was given priority since my close combat was severely lacking. The academy was offering a limited fighting style to its students, one that was easily outmatched in raw power and speed by the Uchiha clan Taijutsu. It was terrible the first week. Madara was relentless with his comments, bringing up in punctual details how my stance was either too rigid or too at ease, how my reaction time was crappy in the worst times, and how he was hitting me softly, and tears were not going to make him stop. To be fair, what made some tears fall off wasn't the fact I wasn't expecting this much pain, but the fact that my tiny body was more sensible than an adult's one. It didn't have the same pain endurance as my original body, and thus everything coming my way stung harder than expected. I wasn't really crying at getting wrecked by a veteran shinobi, but rather my body reacted in that manner at the sudden and intense pain. When the second week began, things took a strange positive twist. And not only about the training sessions. I was gaining more resilience and understanding of the Uchiha Taijutsu the more time I spent training with it and against it. Madara wasn't merciful, but he would concede a couple of pauses along the sessions. It was tough, but not impossible by the end of the day. The change that actually caught me off guard was that I somehow got popular at the academy because of it. While people weren't unsure what I was doing with Madara, the fact that the Uchiha kids were spending an unexpected amount of time close to me and trying to build up social relations was more than enough to warrant quite the inner inquiry about the matter. Maybe the family thought of me as an honorary Uchiha since their clan chief was teaching me, but I was quite sure that Madara himself had no implication on the matter. It wouldn't help me nor him at training, and he wasn't certainly trying to flex his apprentice so strongly before the Senju brothers. Tobirama was fairly moderate himself from what I knew from Hiruzen. Whatever bed had been made once Madara had gone to him and Hashirama to gloat over my abilities, it didn't seem worth of making a large fuss over it. Still, this very subversion of my lonely pace at school left me with a single positive change that would end up becoming useful in the future. Kagami Uchiha, one of the low-born members of the clan, was someone that didn't seem interested in making ambitious gains by befriending me. He was more of a follower than a rival and someone that just ended up following the collective thought and try his efforts and reaching for me. What truly made him stand out compared to the rest was the kind of question he asked me when we ended up sitting near to each other. "Is Madara-sama tough with his lessons?" I was almost surprised when I first heard the blunt query, and I spared some moments of silence before giving him a quick yes while I glanced back at him. If I had to make a comparison between other members of the Uchiha clan, Kagami was a strange mix of Obito and Sasuke. He was naive just like the former, and terribly silly when it came in making friends outside of his clan, but he was also attentive to class and seemed to have already a good understanding of the great fireball jutsu. Adding him to the conversations with Hiruzen brought up a quality element I would have never expected the boy to bring up. With the young Sarutobi being initially uneasy while having a member of the Uchiha clan listening in our discussions, the brunette seemed to change approach when he noticed that there was nothing of the arrogant and pompous elements that made up a large majority of the family. In fact, I could tell that both him and Kagami were bonding quickly. Way more quickly than I expected it to be. Still, it was good to be broadening the circle of peers with a third member, and thus our little group started to get more livelier thanks to our newest mutual friend. But while things might have been pleasant because of these developments, I sure hadn't expected for Tobirama and Madara to take their bet to the next step. It all started when Hiruzen and I were called to reach the academy. It was Sunday morning and there was no one waiting for us at the entrance. Do you think that they are waiting inside? I glanced at Hiruzen with a half-tired look. I had woken up in a panic as Okayasan had rushed to my room with an urgent letter from Madara requesting my immediate presence. I had planned to spend the early hours of the morning in my futon, preparing physically and mentally for today's afternoon session with the Uchiha clan leader. With my plans burned so suddenly because of some petty and childish rivalry, and with me rushing through my usual morning routine to not turn out late, I ended up finding Hiruzen waiting by the gates. He had been summoned with a letter similar to mine, this one actually signed by Tobirama. The young Sarutobi didn't look any better than I was. Maybe even worse considering the sleep bags underneath his eyes. "The gates are closed," I pointed out calmly. The boy blinked at me, glancing back at the gates and then back at me. I didn't notice. Mighty God, Kami-sama, and Tamamo-chama, why are we suffering for two morons' bet? Sighing at the response, I turned back at the gates, but more specifically at the small wall that I knew both Hiruzen and I could vault with little effort. "We can still check inside," I muttered quietly, gaining once again Hiruzen's attention on me. "But the gates are closed," he repeated my words, and I almost facepalmed at the lifeless voice it was all delivered. "We can still check." "Maybe they were busy and couldn't receive us at the entrance," I commented back, pointing at the small wall as we both approached it. "Anyway this situation goes, I don't think we can get in trouble for merely snooping around." The young Sarutobi looked uncertain at first, but the unwillingness to keep waiting standing up under the sun eroded any moral reluctance to break that implicit rule of not entering the building during weekends. Nobody was there to check the place, and so our infiltration proved to be as easy as drinking from a glass of water. The academy was desolate as we ventured inside and we couldn't hear anything that could help us in our search. If the two adults were indeed within the premises of the building, then they had to be somewhere near the principal's office. Tobirama was known to keep to that room during most of the time at the school, which wasn't spent to give lectures to his assigned classrooms. After going 2 floors up thanks to the simple staircase built by the entrance, we started to wander by the administrative area of the academy. The zone was forbidden to students in normal circumstances, but there were occasions where teachers would send kids to pick up books that were available by the library in the specific floor. Right now, Hiruzen and I were keeping a somewhat attentive stance as we delved deeper in the silent halls of the school. Could it have been a ploy to annoy us? No. Even though Madara would have done this to me, I couldn't see him actually agreeing with Tobirama about the matter. Something was indeed off with the lack of someone waiting at the entrance, and perhaps something bad had happened before we arrived there. Staring left and right, I took a sudden pause as I finally heard a noise. It was muffled, but I could recognize the difference from the continuous silence surrounding us. Hiruzen seemed to have heard it too as he tensed up right as I did. Our pace increased a little bit as we rushed to where we heard the noise and another one reached our ears. Confusion swelled as we stopped before the door that led to the room in which the ruckus was going on. Things were muffled, but we could hear some brawling happening inside. But wasn't the Hokage's office meant to be empty today? During the weekends, the Hokage was allowed to deal with paperwork right at home. One of the few situations that had changed by the time the Sandaime would take over the role. And that meant whoever was inside it was neither the Hokage nor someone with friendly intentions. Madara wouldn't have concocted something this complicated and not this malicious. I had done everything to keep him pleased, or at least happy with the way I handled training. There were no guards around, and there had been no shinobi wars to reinforce the need of keeping watch over important places. A foreign intruder? Could it be that an enemy spy had infiltrated Konoha? I gritted my teeth at the chances of this being the truth, and I glanced at Hiruzen with a serious look. The brunette had sobered up and listened to my whispered orders of keeping close quite earnestly. I took a couple of steps toward the door, reaching for the handle with my left hand while my right one was inside my pouch to fish out a kunai. Holding my breath in, I carefully unlocked the mechanism and peeked inside. I tensed up again, this time a light blush erupting on my face as I saw that there were two individuals there. One, a man from his muffled voice, was sitting by the chair behind the desk, while the other, a woman, had settled by the man's lap. I couldn't see perfectly the features of the man, but since I recognized the red hair combed in two buns that were telling hints about a certain character in this era, I felt dread at what I was looking at. Mito Uzumaki let out a brief giggle as she tried to unfasten Hashirama's shirt. Her kimono was slightly unraveled, but I could see only her pale upper back from my current position. Gulping nervously, I felt paling as I soon realized that this was much worse than a spy stealing military secrets. We just ended up catching the Hokage and his wife ready to go through the deed. And his wife was a red-haired Uzumaki. I didn't linger any longer with the stare, carefully closing the door. I glanced at a confused Hiruzen, the boy growing nervous at my panicked look. "We need to leave," I whispered quickly. "Why?" "I will tell you later," I answered swiftly. "We can't get caught by them." "What is going dash?" He didn't finish the sentence that he ended up tripping on some uneven part of the carpet. The fall ended up with Hiruzen landing on his butt, but the impact was enough to warrant a noticeable thud out of it. My eyes widened even more at the noise, feeling thousand screeches exploding in my head at what had just up. I heard something shuffle inside the office, and then footsteps. Pulling Hiruzen up from the ground, I pushed him to start to run. Go. I whispered furiously, paying no attention at the sudden slam created by a furious Uzumaki trying to catch us in there. But I pumped more chakra in my legs, and urging Hiruzen to do the same. The young Sarutobi made the mistake of giving a quick glance behind, and, from the way he suddenly paled and increased his pace, I knew that the situation was as ugly as I thought it to be. It was just as we turned the corner that I remembered that we weren't dealing with simple individuals. The entire section of the hall between us and the emergency staircase was filled with a mix of vines and golden chains blocking the passage. Our pursuers were catching up without any pause, and I knew that we couldn't get caught like this. Not with Mito Uzumaki giving chase to us. So I decided to make a hasty decision and indulge Hiruzen to prepare one of the futon techniques that Tobarama had taught him. At first the brunette was confused as Wind-style, Great Breakthrough didn't have the power to break the chains, but he still complied the very moment he noticed that I was making hand seals myself. Snake, ram, monkey, boar, horse, tiger. I felt the blaze building up in my lungs as I waited for Hiruzen to let out the C-rank Wind-style jutsu, releasing the fire only as I noticed the gust rushing out of his lips. The two jutsu combined in a magnified attack. One that easily melted through the chains and the vines, keeping us from leaving the place. We didn't wait any longer as we found our way cleared. Both Hashirama and Mito were moments away from turning the corner, and we had to quickly reach for the staircase. It was an intense chase, one that I was expecting to leave unscathed with Hiruzen, but then I remembered that Mito could do much more with her chains if she had her targets on sight. I yelped as I felt two cold and metallic restraints wrapped around my legs, and I saw the young Sarutobi beside me fall the same moment I did. Before we had the chance of crawling away, a voice breached our hopes of survival. Well, Mito muttered calmly. To think that we would end up finding two young peeping toms while we were busy. Hashirama sighed. Danzo-kun, Hiruzen-kun, the man mentioned with a disappointed tone. I can't believe you both decided to do this dash. We didn't do anything willingly, I stated fiercely. We were called by our senseis through urgent letters. Hiruzen nodded frantically. Tobarama sensei said that I was needed at the academy, and Uchiha-sama did the same to Danzo-kun. They looked at us with a stern look, but then the redhead sighed. "Do you have the papers on you?" We nodded, and we presented the respective scrolls with the messages in those. Mito took these in her hands, reading each silently and blankly. A tense minute passed and she sighed. "Dear, did you tell Tobirama-kun that we were going to be spending time together?" Hashirama frowned at the question, but he gave a calm nod. It was just to avoid him interrupting us. "And I suppose the same reason is applied to why you told this to Madara-kun too." There was an awkward silence from the Hokage, with the Senju giving an uneasy look at that. "I didn't think that. We will discuss about this later, Hashi-kun," the woman rebuked softly. "First, we should let the boys stand and go. Wouldn't want to traumatize them with what I've planned to do to you." The man actually shivered at the implied threat, and I found an interesting opportunity to get some revenge at our absent teachers. "Actually, Mitoheim," I interjected with the most appeasing of tones possible, drawing both the woman's and the Hokage's attention. "I think it wouldn't just do to let us go. In fact, if Madara-sensei and Tobirama-sama were able to do this so easily, then it wouldn't be wrong to assume they could do worse to prank you and your husband." Her eyes narrowed with a fascinated glint. "Are you suggesting a lesson to impart to them?" I had expected her to be a little more stern about returning prank to prank. But then again, I was talking to an Uzumaki. If Kushina and Naruto were clear examples of the prankfulness running rampant in the family, I shouldn't be doubting that Mito herself was a queen of pranks in her younger days. "Something that would require yours and Hokage Dana's assistance," I replied with a nod. "It's nothing harmful, but it will be decisive in making it clear that they shouldn't be using Hiruzen and I for their silly antics, and not disturb you in your alone time." Mito nodded intrigued, ignoring the fact that a 7-year-old had just addressed what they were doing as the subject of the talk. Hashirama didn't from the way he blushed, but he seemed to calm down as I started to explain the simple plan meant to humble the two morons to a proper degree. I wasn't sure that Madara's arrogance was going to be weakened by this, but he surely was going to learn to not use me as a tool of jealousy to get his rival's attention. And boy, revenge was going to be as sweet as chocolate milk. Chapter 3, The Will, 2. A new day, and a brand new problem to deal with caution and fury. I was never the kind of man that loved to prank people to get back at them. Maybe it was because I never had a reason to make use of pranks in general. Even as a kid, I still had my own limits and my own brattiness. But now that the situation couldn't have been solved through mature means, I guess a prank was the best bet. Two students have to explain a couple of things to two foolish masters. I was still surprised that Madara had indirectly teamed up with Tobirama. The first Hokage confirmed that the two hadn't somehow allied just for this stupid event by checking if they had somehow contacted each other over the matter. Part of me blamed fate itself for having conjured such a troublesome coincidence. But then again, I really wanted to test what the leader of the Uchiha had as patience. I knew from my own knowledge that the guy was already easy to anger, possibly because there wasn't much of a proper settlement over his brother's passing. Sure, he might have accepted Hashirama's dream as the proper route to take instead of keeping on to the old Warring States era, but he still hated both the Senju brothers for never addressing the death of Azuna Uchina, which Tobirama was responsible for. Kishimoto never explained how both sides settled over this sore spot, but I had reason to believe that there was never a settlement about it from the way this bitter rivalry still continued to exist. I could understand if it was just a childish one, but the generally crass insults and the malicious threats once in a while did show the true nature of their relationship. And despite my early reluctance to actually pit both morons one against the other, Mito found my initial plans of dealing with them individually to be too lenient for how the two shinobi had handled their responsibilities as our masters. Hiruzen wasn't keen to offer any suggestion, keeping to himself as I tried to come up with the best plan possible for both Hashirama and his wife to accept. The former was quite easy to satisfy. Albeit he was pissed at what had happened, he was still a goof when dealing with his brother and childhood friend. I didn't blame him wholeheartedly, as I knew that he was inherently kind because of his ancestors' influence. But Mito? She was incredibly petty over the matter. I had to dissuade her multiple times from actually employing anything that could offer permanent damage at the two. While I had expected a mind geared for pranks, I wasn't really hoping for her to be this brutal with revenges. Eventually we concocted a fairly simple plan that involved a letter detailing about an important mission, a booby trap building, and lots of whipped cream. Yes, in a world without TVs and other electronic appliances, the delicious thing was actually available at the market. It had appeared as one of the first inventions born just after Konoha's creation, and I expected it to be the result of the first stable civilian-based economy funneling funds for new technologies. Conflict might not be around the corner, but the fact that the Hokage had promoted a general sense of prosperity for everyone from the very beginning was enough of a warning to start and improve life conditions. Shinobi, merchants, peasants, bureaucrats, everyone was enlisted in that silent mission of making Konoha a great place to house the clans scattered all over the Land of Fire. But that wasn't important to the great event for today. I woke up a little after than yesterday's hour, and my first destination was the academy. Differently from what had developed from yesterday, Hiruzen and I did find Mito and Hashirama already waiting for us. There were two jonins speaking with the Hokage, quickly disappearing once we were close enough to the couple. Ah, the body flicker technique. I really need to get my hands on a scroll containing its instructions as quickly as possible. Hiruzen-kun, Danzo-kun, I hope you're both ready for today, and the brunette paused, looking slightly concerned. Maybe we could have done this a little later instead of asking them to be awake this early in the morning? Mito huffed. I'm sure these two will get plenty of rest once we're done with Madara-kun and Tobirama-kun. I hope you're not planning to allow the two fools to get a chance to punish the children with some harsh training. The subtle threat was easy to perceive, and even someone as dense as Hashirama couldn't help but notice the moment this reached his ears. Oh, of course not, he stated with a brief moment of uneasiness, swiftly recovering from it. I will let them have a full day to rest. Then he offered us a kind smile, with Mito following up with a calm sigh and a patient look. Our next stop was the little setting the Hokage himself had decided for us to stay as the prank unfolded. It was a small hill that offered sight over the scene. The walls of the building were still going to cover the action itself, but the place granted us a proper look over where the two fools were going to leave the building. But some explanation is certainly needed to understand the simple but effective prank that was going to unfold. While Madara and Tobirama were probably waiting to receive some immediate punishment from either the Hokage or his much scarier wife, they weren't going to miss any serious letter coming from the Hokage's office. The sudden letter sent at both would surely spark their suspicions, but the content of the letter itself was written in a manner that it would have been difficult for them to refuse. A rogue clan had decided to create chaos in the village by setting up a bomb within one of the still-in-use buildings in the settlement. Their job was to find the explosive and defuse it. The selling spot? Some low-key praises that justified their candidacy in that solo mission. Albeit they weren't closely related, both Madara and Tobirama still had the same habit of flaunting their own abilities and prides left and right. The Uchiha was the worst of the two, but the youngest of the Senju brother wasn't that far from him. The letters had been sent just a couple of minutes earlier before Hiruzen and I had the chance to arrive at the gates of the academy. With our quick-paced stroll to reach our current spot, it was expected for the two to find each other and the bomb in 3, 2. Cosplat. I bit down a groan at the fact that I had been off by just a second, my attention stolen as I saw two figures rushing through the window's instance before the explosive fully detonated, and they were unable to dodge the scattershot of whipped cream completely wrapping around their frames. While Tobirama merely groaned at the disastrous development, Madara kept quiet as his brain tried and failed to understand what had just happened. Both were coated in white, but the Uchiha suffered the most considering how his long hair weren't spared by the punishment. All in all, it looked quite the messy situation for them both. Heh. There was silence at first, but soon it was Mito that broke the quiet by letting out a muffled giggle. Hashirama snorted, while Hiruzen's own smile was twitching as the boy tried to hold back a full laughter at the amusing scene. I held a proper smile, as my entertainment was dampened by the fact that now we would have to approach the two, and see their reaction dangerously close. It would seem that you two have ended up in a sticky situation, the Uzumaki said as she spearheaded the group towards the unfortunate victims of the prank. To think that the mighty Uchiha and the swift Senju were defeated by whipped cream. Tobirama had the decency to allow a huff to leave his lips, while the gunby wielder gawked at the approaching group. His surprised eyes took a moment to study the four of us, only to settle on me. He narrowed his dark charcoals in a furious manner. You dash. Don't blame the child for the fact you are the one that warranted my wrath, Madara-kun, Mito interjected before the Uchiha had the chance to continue. Both of you, how could you thought that Hashirama and I would have allowed you free after this foolish behavior you both displayed? Tobirama frowned in confusion at first, noticing that his sister-in-law was mentioning a plan he might have shared with Madara, and then realization struck him shocked as he stared at the annoyed man. You copied me. Madara turned, his annoyance doubling at the accusation. What? He asked coldly, only for Hashirama to answer in his brother's stead. Yesterday, you both sent your apprentices to disrupt my time together with Mitoheim, the brunette explained with a tired sigh. I swear, you two are really starting to become too much to bear with your own antics. Then control your brother, Senju, the Uchiha rebuked dryly. Instead of allowing him to bark madly left and right, perhaps you should assign him to boarder's duty. As if your word actually mattered in the decision-making of this village, team. And they were bickering again. I felt Hiruzen walking closer to where I was, holding a hand up close to my ear to whisper something to me. Do you think they will remember about us? Allowing a grimace on my face, I shook my head. Nope. And while I was quite convinced of this considering how intense that shouting contest suddenly became, I had forgotten about an element that I had yet to still see in action before this common dynamic. If you think you can just ignore us by trying to appear angry at each other, then I have something else coming for you both, Mito exploded in a fierce fury. This is not the first time that you decide to drag Hashirama and I into your petty exchanges. And I think it's high time you both apologize to each other for being this stupid. I will never apologize to that filthy piece of dash. Enough, Hashirama interrupted his rival. Not before the children and... Mitoheim is right. You two have been going at each other for months now. I thought you would have calmed down once things had settled down properly and... I was wrong. Madara snorted. And what do you plan to do then? Banish me? I noticed the Hokage narrowing his eyes at the brazen Uchiha in that very moment and... I felt dread. Did I unwittingly escalate the breakup process between the two reincarnations? The mere thought was enough to trigger plenty of alarms in my head, and my brain ditched self-preservation to make an effort to avoid this possibility to happen. Instead of keeping put as the scene would have demanded from me, I finally moved from my standing beside the young Sarutobi and made a few steps toward the irked Uchiha, before turning around to face the Hokage to offer the man a formal bow. Hokage Dano, please don't take his words as ones delivered out of lucidity, I muttered quickly and tensely. I felt my throat tightening at the fact I was trying to defend Madara before the Konoha's leader. The prank, the fact that he is sparring words with Tobirama-sama, these elements are influencing him to be this much blunt. You know that Uchiha-san is someone that will never accept this kind of defense, Danzo-kun? Hashirama inquired calmly. Despite the good points you're bringing up to understand his behavior, are you sure you want to go through with this? I thought about it, knowing that now I was going to get punished by the man for doing something so humiliating and unneeded, but I still nodded. Yes, Hokage Dano. The oldest of the Senju clan sighed tiredly. Forgive me if I bring up bad memories by saying this, but didn't your father die a few weeks before the Shimura clan properly joined Konoha no Sato? Oh okay, why he needed to go with that. Why yes, Hokage Dano, I replied with an uneasy tone. Did your mother let you read the letter that your father sent to Konoha before leaving your first home? Was there a letter? And why would my mother need to tell me about it? No. He sighed, this time his tone clearing away from any sadness and worry. Your father was endeared by the idea of bringing peace through unity. He wanted to be part of this idea, and to see his son grow away from the horrors of war and death, Hashirama continued, his voice resounding as if he was bringing up a fond memory. He also believed in the will of fire. The chances of bringing an end to conflict through love and understanding. It was a novelty for me, but one that really didn't paint Danzo in a better light than I remember him as. Heck, I think this revelation worsened up the big picture the head of the root had created through his actions during his last years of life. Madara, we will discuss later about this, the Hokage concluded with a slow nod. I think you have much to think about. The Uchiha was quiet at first. I had expected him to snap at my humiliating defense, and yet he had kept silent as I spoke with his childhood friend. He offered a muffled grunt before walking up to me and grasped at my shoulder. His hold wasn't outright painful, but I noticed that he was squeezing a little bit too much as to dignify his current mood. Madara dash. Before the brunette had the chance to urge his rival to calm down, the world around us warped and we were no longer in Konoha. Did it actually happen? Did Madara actually snap and... How is your control over the fireball jutsu? He inquired blankly as he let me go and advanced towards a large body of water that was just beside us. I blinked at it, or rather, I stared up at the large system of tubes and pipes that extended over and within the limpid lake. It's good? What is going on? Where were we right now? This location was unfamiliar, but I was sure that we were nowhere near to Konoha. How did we get in there when the only teleportation jutsu was Tobirama's Flying Thunder God technique? Prove it. Use it towards that opening, the Uchiha ordered while pointing at the strange entrance that connected with the rest of tubes spread all over this area. I gave a confused look as I approached closer to the target, stealing a glance at Madara as the man started to remove his stained armor. What's going on? I couldn't really understand what was happening, but I still complied with his demand. Calibrating my jutsu as I had grown accustomed to, I released the fireball while aiming at the proper opening of the pipes and it swiftly was siphoned inside the tubes. Heat started to spread all over the place as the water quickly warmed up at the increase of temperature. A few seconds later, I found myself gawking at the thin fog that was created by the warm water. A natural onsen? Why are we here and... My brain failed to conclude that thought as I saw Madara enter the lake without saying anything. His armor and his folded clothes put close to the edge he had entered from. There was silence at first, and I merely stared at what was unfolding before my tired eyes. Yet the man didn't seem content with the current status quo and sighed loudly. Join me. I blinked, gritting my teeth. I think I will pass the offer. You need to clean up. Has he gone mad? I'm perfectly clean and fine. What are you dash? I froze just in time to notice the sticky sensation on my hair. I reached out with my right hand and my eyes widened as I realized what was wrong. He had nudged on me, staining my hair with some of the whipped cream during the warp. That fucking bastard. He was actually smiling right now that the realization was visible out of my face. The smugness of having retaliated back after that prank now evident in his grin. Narrowing my eyes at that cheeky counter, I knew that I couldn't exactly avoid this kind of situation. It was awkward to put my clothes to the side, but then I decided to charge up and go for a high jump. Cannonball! Madara's amusement vanished as the large wave crashed onto him. He quickly glared at me, but my own smugness cancelled any of the malicious effects of such a stare. Heck, he could have switched to his Sharingan, and I would have given no fucks about it for how proud I was. And I thought you were a step above the common brat, the man commented as he started to work on his own hair. Yet you failed me again. I allowed a frown to settle on my visage as I contemplated these words. First, you thought that by appearing like a foolish mongrel before Hashirama would spare me of any escalation, proving how terribly stupid you can be when you're aware of my honor, Madara explained with a calm tone. Then you decide that being a child once more will dissuade me from thinking more about what just happened. Tensing up at that, I continued to stare in shock at the Uchiha. Was he suspecting that I was not? Tell me, Shimura-kun. Do you think like your father did, that understanding your enemy will bring us true peace like Hashirama loves to sprout about? I was tempted to give a convoluted answer, just to disarm the man of any chances of speaking more about it. But then again, I wasn't really hoping to lose my cover so suddenly. So, instead of giving the legitimate answer, I went for the silly but also childlike response to this specific query. Yes. Madara blinked, surprise painting his face at that curt response. Why? I blinked, bringing up a faux nervous look. Because it worked already. Explain. Konoha no Sato was created by the Uchiha clan and the Senju clan. They founded the village that exists now and yet they were at war with each other years ago. I'm aware of that, yes, the man muttered impatiently. But why does this matter to my demand? Would you have accepted peace if you hadn't known Hokage Dano when you were younger, sensei? I inquired back with an innocent tone. Hiruzen told me that you and the Hokage were friends since childhood. I waited for some time, noticing how my early response got a surprised understanding coming from the Uchiha. You think that I accepted this dream of his, because I knew him beforehand? You understood him and you still do. You know that he wasn't lying back then and even now, I pointed out with a nod. I think I can tell right now when Hiruzen-kun is lying to me. He never does since he prefers to be sincere, but I feel like I can tell when he isn't honest to me. I understand Hashirama, Madara pondered quietly, seemingly detaching himself from the conversation. Which is why I believe him despite how many years have gone by. Do you distrust Hokage Dano, sensei? No, he replied dryly. And that, sometimes, makes me think of how silly this all is. He turned to glance at me once more. If you had the chance to decide who is going to be the Hokage from now on, would you choose me or Hashirama? Oh, now he's trying to play the whole but I want to be the Hokage card on Chibi me. Poor guy doesn't know that I've the perfect answer for that. I would choose Hashirama-sama, I stated with a nod. If you were the Hokage, sensei, you wouldn't be my sensei any longer. He frowned at that logic. What are you talking about? Well, when you sent me in that important mission, I emphasized the event in an effort to show my annoyance to it, only to be ignored on that front. I noticed that Hokage Dano had numerous papers still sitting on his desk despite having the large majority of the paperwork in his house. You think that if I had been Hokage, then I wouldn't have had the time to train you? I nodded and he sighed tiredly. I would have left someone else to deal with it, Madara pointed out, and I gave a confused look. Isn't the paperwork the big part of the job? The Uchiha snorted. Being the Hokage means being the strongest, he rebuked dryly. Why do you think I want that stupid hat? I think it's a nice hat, I admitted, a minor degree of smug latching onto my words. His stare narrowed at that quip. But I don't think being the Hokage means being the strongest in the village. Why? Well, the Hokage has to stick by the academy most of his time and he doesn't have time to go in missions, I answered with a sigh. Since you're not the Hokage, sensei, that means you're not restrained from actually going in a fight out of the village to defeat a threat. That sounds ridiculous dash. If there was a skirmish between a clan and Konoha that is beyond a diplomatic resolution, would Hashirama-sama go on his own or send someone like you to deal with them? He didn't answer that. In fact, the conversation kind of ended there as we stood in that onsen for a couple more minutes. Once I was properly clean from the whipped cream, I stood out of the warm lake and allowed the steam to dry me up a little bit before I reached for my clothes. Once we were done with this strange situation, Madara reached for my shoulder again and we warped back inside Konoha. This time we were standing in front of the Uchiha compound. We shall speak again tomorrow, at the usual training spot. Curt, impassive and pretty much stern. Yet, compared to the usual tone, there was a strange touch of leniency. I didn't linger further, noticing that the man was already walking inside the main building of the household, leading me to make my way back home. I was confused, fascinated and overall spent with what happened today. Yet, despite my tiredness, I couldn't help but spend the rest of the day to try and understand if the man had used some unknown jutsu or reverse summoning to get us out and back in Konoha. Nonetheless, I felt like I did make some progress for what was meant to be a silly prank. Hopefully, it's all for good. Chapter 4, The Will, 3. 4 months went by mostly uneventfully. Training still continued, but now I was given more autonomy in which way I was supposed to develop my personal skills. It wasn't difficult to see that Madara's decision to allow me this kind of freedom wasn't driven by kindness or compassion, but more of a necessity drilled in his mind by his war-filled childhood. Children needed to be ready for what was going to happen once the world was embroiled in the newest war. And he knew perfectly enough that despite the creations of the 5 great villages, everlasting neutrality wasn't going to become an instant reward. People had scorn in their hearts and minds, and some of the leaders couldn't forget the years of the warring states just like this. I wasn't sure how the first shinobi war was going to happen, but I know that some of the pieces were already set. Madara was careless enough to lament some of Hashirama's recent decisions in appeasing some of our neighbors. Iwagakure had yet to develop its hatred for Konoha, and I knew that until the head of the Uchiha clan didn't commit for any brainless operations to show dominance, there was going to be none of that degree of animosity. Heck, if I had the chance to interfere, the first thing to do was to smooth out the issues for keeping a stable worldwide peace across the planet. I still had ambitions to make Konoha a prominent country, but I wasn't against pushing a more peaceful agenda to prevent any brain drain and senseless bloodshed. Not when precious manpower was wasted in some meaningless conflict. Which is why, during one of my conversations with my disgruntled sensei, I decided to instill more doubts within his mind. It was all in the name of subtlety, and I was careful enough to not sound older than I appeared. Sensei, but what if you're also wrong? A blink, then a frown, and finally a need for clarification from my simple query. Talking to Madara proved to be a little easier than I originally thought, mostly because I finally got a proper glimpse over his personality as my apprenticeship with him continued. This man had yet to become the ferocious and hateful bastard that almost led to the end of the world, all because of him being influenced by Zetsu. This was someone that still believed in Hashirama's ideas of bringing true peace in this world through diplomacy. Sure, his way of talking with nation was far more aggressive than the current Hokage, but the Uchiha still had plenty of control over his own impatience. Which is why, against all my need to keep my interfering self away from dangerous instances, I tried to carefully lead him to think about specific topics. Topics that were meant to lead him actually ponder over the various situations that left him angry during training sessions instead of gnashing his teeth at the confusing policies created by Hashirama. At first, I was quite careful to not stretch myself and blow my own cover in the process. Then I picked up a more comfortable pace and established something of a logical outlook within the man. It was still work in process, considering that some of my words were either ignored or outright rebuked with the classic "I am an adult, so I know better" excuse. Which was really aggravating from time to time, taking my predicament in consideration. With that little project kept as a side mission for the time being, I gave maximum priority to my own training schedule, as Madara really gave me quite the freedom of choice over the case. The moment I received this little not-so-special privilege from the ancestor of the duck-haired Avenger, I saw fit to raid the specialized library and take back home with me numerous scrolls with C-rank techniques and some training books detailing leaf concentration practice and the tree climbing practice. Practicing took priority over learning new abilities, mostly because I knew that my current arsenal was limited by my own inabilities. My chakra network was barely developed, but it was only natural with how old my body was. Expansion of my reserves was something that required intensive usage of my current energy and allow my own body to bulk up at the demanding requirement of the only ninjutsu I currently knew about. Which meant that keeping up with the pattern established by Madara was going to immensely help, if not more. Control was another grimace-worthy problem that had to be taken care of, since I really needed to reduce the waste of chakra while I used any techniques. Practicing with the initial step to refine my grasp over my energy proved to be somewhat effective after working on it for a full month. It was annoying that the leaf control practice took so long to master, but I was also aware that my subjective understanding of mastering the technique wasn't the basic version of the practice. Many stopped to just lift the leaf without losing control over the lift-off process and the landing procedure, but I took the exercise a couple of steps further by setting myself up in different situations, each with a unique kind of distraction. Finding a windy spot within the village was easy, but practicing by sitting there and try to keep hold with my chakra over the twirling leaf hovering over my head turned out to be more of a struggle than I wanted. Frustration, tiredness, and ultimately irritation. I wasn't spared by any of those as I continued to try my best in sharpening my senses by keeping track of a single leaf before latching a sliver of my chakra onto it to restrain it from following the wind's might. Wind was my element to begin with, thus I had expected this to be the easiest of the arduous tasks I had set up myself to face. And yet I was forced to take on this challenge for a full month before I got it down to a sufficient degree. After making 3 successful attempts, I decided to switch up to another exercise to avoid getting myself too embroiled over the already frustrating practice. Thus I delved into the complexities of climbing trees without making use of my hands. With how refined my control was at the point I started this new segment of the training, the exercise ended up easier than I predicted. The genuine issue I found as I started practicing this different control-based training was the need of keeping some attention over my chakra manipulation while I kept on the new surface. Since I knew that I would eventually need to keep this kind focused the middle of a future fight, I decided to take this as slowly as possible as I grew accustomed with the feeling. 2 weeks flied away and I was able to keep the distracting need to a minimum. And it was all thanks to a bunch of brats accepting this simple, but amusing task of barraging me with water-filled balloons while I went on with my training regimen. The fun part was to explain Mother why I was drenched in water every time I returned back home. It was less amusing when the vendor specialized in this kind of products would switch the water in the tiny projectiles to some of the coldest available. Surely a chilling idea, but one that really shoved me into developing the fastest possible. The drain was negligible, the result was mostly flawless, and I decided against trying my hand over the next step, the water walking practice, as I wasn't in the mood of being further drenched for the time being. No, the next month and a half was wasted in quickly mastering one of the few ninjutsus that ended up catching my attention as good addition to my current arsenal. Something not much offensive, but good enough to warrant my utmost interest for me to give it this much time to learn. But when I started to search for anyone willing to help me with this kind of ability, I also learned that someone I knew about and that I wanted to ask for assistance was also training as intensely as I was. I don't know why Hiruzen was suddenly busy with extra training from both his sensei and his father, but I had the undeniable suspicion that this was once again the fruit of some annoying plan from both Madara and Tobirama. Kagami was still willing to help when I finally asked to him, but he instantly took a major dislike for his rule during the training as he was subjected to quite the humiliating disposition when I applied the technique against him. He wasn't angry, but he would get terribly annoyed and whining each time he was to be used as a training dummy for this kind of ninjutsu. Time passed, and I also added some intense taijutsu and jinjutsu practicing with the ninjutsu training. Part of me knew that something big was going to happen, and that it was going to see both Hiruzen and I as the central theme of it all. Madara was quiet about this all, and I wasn't sure that asking him directly would have yielded any positive response from him. Then I had some trouble in talking with Hiruzen while we were both at the academy, as the brunette was quick to reject any attempt to talk. Even sending Kagami to pry some info out of the young Sarutobi resulted in nothing but silence. Was he angry? The circumstance was the most plausible, and yet I couldn't sense any frustration directed at me from the boy. Plus, I could tell if Hiruzen had any grudge with me, especially since I would have disliked him immensely to get this kind of reaction out of him. So what exactly happened to him? The question kept gnawing at my brain during the few pauses I would get during training. I couldn't get much out of how little clue I had over the matter, and while I had made plans to check with either the Hokage or Mito if they knew anything of what was going on, I decided against troubling them over the matter. I wasn't Naruto, and I didn't have any family-like relationship with Hashirama to use for some advice in this kind of situation. So I waited, patiently so, while also keeping on improving myself. The paranoia was still there to keep me from slipping up with my pace, also inducing me to go more frequently to the weapon shop to buy special equipment in case of emergencies. Smoke bombs were a novelty I found myself endeared to. Not many ninjas had the means to sense their opponents when their sight was obstructed. Thus the addition of this to my available tools was a most pleasing development. With the crescendo of the tension intensifying each day, I finally got the truth out when Madara finally decided to speak about this, and he looked surprised himself when he announced that I had been challenged by Hiruzen. I was confused when he presented me a formal paper, but as I stared down at the signature that legalized the document, I gained an understanding of what was going on. Tobirama had issued the paper. And Madara was clueless of what was exactly happening. How was I sure the Uchiha was an accessory of this stupid match? The man would have bragged for days about it instead of keeping this much quiet and genuinely shocked. So I took this as a childish effort from Hashirama's younger brother to take a shot at his main enemy by pitting me against his own apprentice. While I had simmered down the rivalry by Madara's side, I had completely forgotten that nobody had done anything with Tobirama. God damn it, why am I getting this big of a flaw in my plans this early on? The setting picked by Hiruzen was one of the training grounds near to the one Madara would train me by. The place was pretty much similar to what I was already accustomed to, but instead of being close to the large forest surrounding the village, it didn't have any trees or bushes to create natural obstacles. The land was mostly flat and made up by dirt, with some rocks here and there to create quite the IWAS training ground. I expected this to be a simple challenge. One that didn't require the group of spectators Tobirama decided to invite for the occasion. The Hokage was there, and so was his wife. To their left a large group of people all donning the Sarutobi clan were already cheering on the nervous-looking brunette, and I quickly recognized Hiruzen's mother cheering him the hardest while keeping by the head of the clan's side. Sasuke Sarutobi, one of the greatest shinobis of the Warring States. His fame was legendary in the lore, but his abilities were mostly unknown from the show. He looked like Hiruzen was going to during his adulthood, with the main difference being that he had a full beard instead of a short goatee. But the presence that really got me the most incensed about considering the already frustrating was my own mother standing on the other side. She was there, without nobody else. I spared her a glance, offered her a helpful smile as she tried to hold back onto the silent humiliation Tobirama had unconsciously perpetrated. Imagine being reminded that your entire clan was gone except for yourself and your own child. Amusing? I was having a blast from the way I was glaring daggers at the Hokage's younger brother. The white-haired jerk took notice of it with how surprised he looked as he glanced back at me, but I was quite sure the real shocking element was the degree of contempt someone my age was able to hold towards an adult. Much to my awe and relief, the uneasiness of my mother's loneliness wasn't noticed just by me. Mito merely blinked at me, trailing my glance up to my only parent before standing up from her seat beside her husband and walking to talk with my mother. Mom looked quite awkward at this attention, but from the shy smile she developed shortly after the redhead started to talk with her as kindly and informally as possible, I knew that this issue was solved. Of course, that didn't mean I was going to ignore Tobirama for this slight. A little bit away from the two women talking, Madara took a couple of seconds to silently alternate his sight between me and my mother, and I felt a shiver go down my spine the way he was looking at the now smiling woman. Instead of keeping up with my furious staring, I relaxed before turning my attention to Hiruzen. The boy was nervous as he was in being in that much of a spotlight. He was meant to become the third Hokage, alright, but he was still at the academy student that ended up being noticed by the Hokage's younger brother. He was above average, but it would be incorrect to believe him to have the same fortitude as his weary god of shinobi self. I quickly realized that he wasn't able to stare up at me, a hint of shame flashing from time to time on his face. And I sighed as I knew that it was the fact he believed himself guilty of what is going on. Maybe he thought I was going to hate him for this, and I merely shrugged, a tiny smile appearing on my lips. "I'm not angry at you," I proclaimed quietly, drawing his attention on me. "But I'm quite annoyed that you didn't tell me anything and that you ignored me until now." He blinked, finally mustering enough courage to look at me properly. "Sorry. You owe me ice cream," I replied mirthfully. "And I hope you're ready to see your wallet perishing because that." The joke seemed to get a brief smile, a tentative crack on his uneasy expression before he took a stance against me. I reacted by taking the usual Uchiha kata, stealing my resolve as I knew that I had to do something in the middle of the fight to make this a draw, but also not. While winning would be immensely important, I knew that doing so would set Hiruzen to face direct humiliation with his family. And knowing how much honor was important in this particular age, I wasn't planning to see anyone committing suicide to repel the humiliation. If I lost, then things would be bad for me. Madara would take it as a reason to deprive me of the freedom over my training schedule, and then push me through some intense pro-Uchiha training that would only limit my chances of growing stronger like I planned. Drawing seemed the only option, but I was partly convinced that it could also result in both cases above happening at the same time because it could still be considered a humiliation for both. And I didn't want to cause the worst-case scenario. Today we're here to spectate the spar between Hiruzen Sarutobi of the Sarutobi clan and Danzo Shimura of the Shimura clan, Hashirama stated with a formal and serious tone. This is a formal spar, and it shall be recorded as the settling of a challenge among the young men before us. That I really wasn't aware about. Like, what the heck is wrong with Tobirama? Wasn't he supposed to be the more logical in this kind of stuff? Why was he pushing his hatred for the Uchiha clan to this degree of action? I merely stared at Hiruzen, offering him a sympathetic tone while he tried to recover from his own reluctance. His posture was stiff, unwilling to grow flexible enough as his stance demanded to properly enter in action. If there is anything you two wishes to say, any unwillingness to proceed with this course of action, feel free to speak now that the match has yet to begin. I turned to the Hokage, flashing him a smile. "I'm fine with this." Then I turned back to look at my opponent. "But I hope you will agree to start this slowly." Hiruzen blinked. "Slowly? Just follow my pace." "I will explain." He merely nodded and soon, the fight began. Nothing too difficult or too serious, both of our Taijustas were matching evenly as we were willingly sluggish with our own pacing. I was glad that the brunette understood that I wasn't planning to go through the senseless formality of this match. As much as this sounded as a hazard to do in front of so many important people, I wasn't losing the opportunity to give due punishment to the guilty part for this madness. We put out some distance from our spectators, just enough to allow us to share a conversation without getting heard by anyone watching us. "I know it was your sensei." Again. Hiruzen turned instinctively to Tobirama, noticing just now that the man wasn't able to listen to our conversation. "Why yeah." He was quite annoyed by what happened a couple of months ago. We exchanged some easy blows, keeping the pace realistic but also calm enough to not leave any bruises on ourselves whenever the attacks passed through our defenses. Moving quickly, we were also giving out the impression that we were merely testing each other about our own abilities before going full force. But that wasn't the case, or at least that wasn't what I had in mind for this fruitful situation. "I can tell," I added with a quick hum. "Which is why I think retribution is needed once more." My opponent blinked, dodging a slow punch directed at his jaw and returning the attack with a soft kick for me to block. "How?" The innocent question was met with a devious smile as I knew exactly what to do to get some revenge. It was quite apt that I just had the proper ninjutsu for this specific circumstance. I called it a coincidence, but I already knew it was more of a blessing from the sky. Monkey, boar, hare, rat, snake, rat. Earth release, hiding like a mole technique. I even decided to add the name to it so that Hiruzen could remember it for later. Just as I finished showing him the hand seals, I found my footing disappear as the ground swallowed me whole. Hiruzen complied with the copying, eventually replicating the event much to the spectators' growing confusion. Why would one of the fighters teach his opponent how to use a technique? I emerged quickly enough, but the young Sarutobi had some minor trouble getting out of there without munching on the earth. He looked disgusted, but I quickly nodded at the trouble and pondered over a quick solution. Do it again, but stuck with me now. Offering me a reluctant frown, he reluctantly accepted, and soon we were both underground again. The ground turned as soft as sand and easy to move through as I took hold of Hiruzen's hand and took him quickly underneath our real target. Tobirama seemed to realize that something was wrong by how tense his legs were when we sprouted out of the ground and took hold of his legs each. He didn't have time to escape as we both pulled him down until only his head was freed from that natural restriction. Pulling Hiruzen out of the ground together with me and without him dealing with that unpleasant issue of earth-eating, we both stared down at the incapacitated Senju. What is the meaning of this? Tobirama-sama, I wish to make it clear that what happened a couple of months ago wasn't just a mean to return the favor over a certain irritating attempt you pulled against Hiruzen-kun, I started to say with a serious tone. But also a clear message of us being unwilling to be used for any petty rivalry you have with my teacher. We might be kids, but we're far from dumb as you try to portray us. I didn't linger with my stare over the annoyed man, turning back to Hiruzen with a bright smile. About that ice cream. He tensed up a little bit at this response. Be behind dash. May I join you for this occasion? I froze up as I felt a hand settling on my shoulder, while another reached for the brunette's own shoulder. Hashirama smiled, anything resembling his serious self before they gone, much to my surprise. How much of a manchild this guy's is. But instead of rebuking the unexpected offer, I merely smiled and nodded. Of course. After all, Hiruzen is the one that pays. The young Sarutobi panicked at this betrayal, throwing an accusing look for having thrown out that detail in front of the Hokage. I suppose it's a nice morning to spend with the family, friends, and ice cream, another voice added, and we both glanced at Hiruzen's father as he nodded in agreement at our proposal. Soon the acceptance was shared by the rest of the spectators, and we all started to vacate the training ground. Our main destination was now the parlor that was near to the academy building, a certain boy crying salty tears when his usually plump wallet was emptied of most of its content, much to his reluctance. But the most endearing bits of this aftermath was that I genuinely saw Madara smiling at how I had handled things, while also appearing a little uneasy when I gave him a smile back. Maybe he thought I was throwing him a silent threat to not do anything of the kind against us? I mean, I technically had done this already, but I guess that works too. And while I enjoyed a pleasant day off from my usual training, Tobirama Senju was left to bask under the sun for a couple more of hours. Eventually his brother came back to pick him up, only for the Hokage to chuckle the whole way back to the academy building while pointing out how tan his younger sibling had gotten. Tobirama wasn't amused. Chapter 5, The Will, 4. My breath itched as I tried to conjure my third fireball jutsu. The fiery sphere of murder traveled through the air like a messenger of death before colliding with the target in front of me. The training ground was quiet, with only my moving and the noise created by my chakra techniques disrupting the silence that lingered in that tortured land. Madara was staring at the scene as he sat by a nearby tree's branch. The Uchiha looked interested in the display of raw destruction, yet seemed more intrigued by my initiative in spending weeks to increase my reserves and further sharpen my skills with the jutsus I currently knew about. Even though I don't have to worry about Tobirama pitting me against his apprentice, I still figured that I shouldn't lose my current pace, now that my sensei is spending more time to check on my progress. Days swiftly passed by as I tried to master the troublesome sensation that came with the usage of even the simplest fire jutsu. The fireball technique was the beginning of a lengthy journey that I needed to go through for the sake of lessening the issues brought by this natural weakness I had, and Madara was quick to provide me with the next step via the gifting of a scroll. The paper contained the hand signs for the usage of the fire release, Phoenix Sage fire technique, and the jutsu was far from easy to get to an average level despite it being the same rank as the fireball jutsu. Fire release was the priority for now as I took a brief pause from testing the only earth release technique I had. Not like I really wanted to delay these particular sessions, but Kagami had mentioned something about having nightmares of being buried alive. Did I exert his childish mind a little bit too much? Nah, I could tell he was just bringing up the best reason to skip being the target. Hiruzen seemed to be unwilling to replace the young Uchiha, citing that he was training so hard under his father and his sensei that adding this stress to his body would get him scolded by his mother. A tragic predicament that I was sure going to resolve with enough patience and persuasion. A child I might be, but I was still Danzo Shimura. Well, in name at least. 2 months had gone away ever since I fought against Hiruzen, and while training proceeded smoothly and quickly, I still found myself struggling with a few issues that I had long ignored and that now were starting to become difficult to avoid. The first problem was that Mito seemed to have taken a strange interest in both me or Hiruzen. While this could have been easily ruled out as a young woman just wanting to play around with children, my suspicions of this being a little more than that ended up proved right as the woman started to clutch her stomach each time she had to crouch during her visits. At first I thought that she had managed to already seal the QB within herself thanks to Hashirama's help in suppressing the nine-tailed beast's negative chakra, but this assessment was already disproved when Madara made no remark over a possible battle being behind the strange behavior. And then it all hit me at once. Ninja don't have a correct way of figuring out if a woman was pregnant before the formation of a noticeable bump on the woman's belly just yet. So it came quite as a surprise when I felt a noticeable growth by her belly when she was giving the umpteenth hug to both her adorable friends. Mito was pregnant with the Hokage's heir or heiress. This news was good to hear, and it confirmed my early suspicions that the woman was going to conceive a child before becoming the first Jinchuriki. It wasn't an important dilemma considering that it didn't explain why the Senju clan was going to somehow thin out to only have Tsunade as its leader and remaining member, but it did defeat the chance of the family dying out to some birth complications encountered by Mito as the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Still, despite the lovely novelty, the fact that we were going to spend a lot of time around Lady Hokage meant that both Hiruzen and I were going to become the prime targets of the redhead's mood swings once the pregnancy had entered an advanced stage. And that prospect left me morbidly curious to see the full destructive capacity of a pregnant Uzumaki, and horrified at the fact I was going to be subjected to this without any safety net about the matter. Yep, these were going to be a couple of dreadful months. It didn't help that poor Hiruzen was clueless about the disaster that was soon to come, allowing himself to be pampered and spoiled by the happy Mito whenever she decided to invite us for some time together. But I knew for sure that Sasuke Sarutobi, the young boy's father, was more than aware of the hell that we were being forced to walk into. Differently from what I had imagined about the legendary shinobi and founder of the first clan that joined Konoha, the man seemed to be perfectly level-headed and a good conversationalist. None of the impressive charisma alluded to in the rare times he was brought up in the lore, but he really gave off the impression of being someone loyal and trustworthy for most things. He was supportive and proud of his son, and he seemed to be glad of the fact I was friends with Hiruzen. The first time I was invited by the brunette to have a sleepover at the Sarutobi compound, I was taken aside by his father for a simple discussion. Nothing too heavy, or nothing that I could consider a threat in any shape or form, but the talk opened a curious glimpse over Hiruzen's life before he joined the academy. A loner, the reason that drove him to be friendless before he met me was related to Sasuke's legendary status within his own clan. Many saw the boy as the second coming of the brilliant shinobi, and various children had tried to befriend him out of respect for the man rather than simple and personal interest over making friends. I was the first true friend he had the chance of making, and that very detail left me incredibly unhappy for the remainder of the day. Thinking back at how things went when the original Danzo cut the friendship ties with Hiruzen, I could now see how that was perhaps worse than the show displayed it. How much damage would have the original owner of this body done had I not been chosen to replace him? The answer was possibly easy to establish, but I felt very unnerved to think too much about it without aching in the self-loath. I was going to fix things, and they're going to stay fixed this time. And one of the things I was going to fix was getting Madara away from my mother. The simply creepy staring that I took notice about when I sparred with Hiruzen ended up becoming far more of a pressing issue than I wanted. First came the sudden visits early in the morning at my house by the Uchiha clan leader to pick me for training. The visits would result in unplanned conversations between the two adults, with Madara doing his best to be subtle with his interest in learning more of the woman, while my mother was just chatting about me. Any progress, if I had some issues or if I complained with how things were, and that very development left me glad and perplexed at the same time. One would think that a widow would have been unable to display this degree of denseness with someone as subtle as Madara could get. But looking back at the state of mind she had been under because of our current situation as a family, I could see her thinking about this but swiftly dismissing it over some unfounded self-hating. Still, it was good since the man found himself facing a resilient wall that he hadn't planned to deal with just like that. The only bad thing of this instance was that this could easily turn into a positive factor in Madara's eyes, considering how this could all remind him of his rivalry with Hashirama. And the Uchiha clan leader was someone that wouldn't back away at the first hint of a challenge. Not when I existed as a reason to pursue this endeavor. At first I was confused by what had driven him to try this, and I knew that I was mostly at fault about it. With my meddling, I gained his interest and curiosity as a child he could actually tolerate, if not more. And that set up a strange precedence that reminded him of a topic he had never pursued about either for a reason or another. He was celibate, and as the clan leader he had a duty to his family to sire an heir. In the original timeline, Madara never had the proper chance to think about starting a family on his own. Hashirama managed to do this thanks to Mito, but the Uchiha ended up dying without a wife just like Tobirama was going to. When I came by, Madara perhaps saw something worth of studying with more caution and genuine seriousness. And when he realized that my mother was single, he felt like he had discovered the winning formula behind flawless romancing. Spoiler alert, the man wasn't good at math from the way he messed up various encounters. The fact that I was actively blocking his means to score something successful also interfered with his chances of ever winning that senseless war. I wasn't going to allow a prick like Madara to settle down with my mother. While I wasn't the woman's original son, I wasn't heartless enough to let her live the rest of her life together with the bastard. That would just be plain cruelty on a living being, and I wasn't aiming to become a monster before and beyond the temporary years of war that were soon to come. A sigh left my lips as I recollected my thoughts away from those distracting topics. The session was far from over, and I carefully walked toward the nearby lake to start exercising my water walking skill. The troublesome chakra refining technique was tough early on and I had yet to get a decent grasp over it, but I knew that I was making grand steps toward a good result about it. I wobbled while pushing energy to my feet, moderating the stream as to neither sink into the cold lake or propel myself off the liquid surface. And I was more keen to feel the chills considering how the latter option was far more dangerous and painful than the former. Distracted for good enough reasons, I didn't notice that someone had arrived at the training grounds. Madara did, and he jumped off the tree's branch before calmly approaching our unexpected visitor. 10 minutes flew away as I felt happy with the progress made for today. I quickly backtracked to proper ground, jumping off the water's surface and almost tripping in the process. A sigh left my mouth before I turned my attention to where Madara had gone. The man was talking to someone I was familiar with. Someone I wasn't planning to encounter just yet since I had last seen her the day before. Mito was smiling as she waved before rushing towards me. I paused, tension forcing my posture to straighten up as I felt a higher number of chills going down my spine as I felt that something was indeed wrong about this unplanned development. A giggle left the redhead's lips as she lifted me off the ground and twirled around as I was pressed on her chest. "Dakuen, I found you." These were the scariest words I could have heard from someone as level-headed and serious as Mito. The surprisingly happier mood I was being subjected to not only left me worried, but I was also unnerved by the fact I was being coddled like this. To be reduced to this behavior, pregnancy is sure a frightening thing. Mitoheim I tried to greet back. "Did you miss me?" She interrupted with a giddy query. "Did you?" I felt my throat tightening at the chilling scene I was being subjected to. "Why, yes." "Good," she replied, ignoring the uncertain tone that I had while answering. "I missed you too. A lot. Like with Hiruzen." "That's good to know." Mitoheim Today is a beautiful day, Dakuen, the woman interrupted again with an eager hum. "In fact, I wish for you to come with me to my house. Hiruzen is already there." "A sudden visit? Why?" Before I had the chance to ask about this, she nodded. "We've guests from my home, Uchiha." Blinking in surprise, I finally got an idea of what could have gotten her this much ecstatic. Considering that everyone in the recently built village were all part of the Uzumaki clan, it was simple to see that the envoy coming to visit was part of her close family. Still, I decided to bite the bait and ask. "Family dash?" "Yes," she exclaimed before giggling. "The Uzukage, my older brother, and my niece are going to arrive at the manor soon and I want you and Hiruzen around to entertain little Yoshiko-chan." And now I could see another reason for the Lady Hokage to be this giddy. Another child, this time her niece, was visiting together with the current leader of Uchiha. "And we should start moving already, or else we will turn up late," the woman muttered as she started to walk away from the training grounds, sparing a mere nod in Madara's direction, and keeping on carrying me. "Mitoheim?" She blinked, giving me a wide smile. "Yes, Dakuen." I was starting to hate that blasted pet name. "I can walk on my own," I pointed out, only to be granted a simple nod. "You could, but you're also tired from training." "I'm sweaty," I added, trying my best to get let go at once in the most polite of ways. She was wearing a high-quality kimono, surely she had the common sense to. "I'm more concerned about your well-being, Dakuen. My dress will not be ruined by some sweat drop." I gritted my teeth, glad that my face was obscured by the way I was being hugged. "Mata-sensei will try to get on with my mother if I'm not there and dash. I've already asked for Lady Sarutobi to invite your mama for a tea party," Mito interjected with a thoughtful nod, a brief break from her current state of mind. "What a responsible boy. Thinking about the plight of your poor mama and dealing with the rough romancing of Madara. I can understand your worry, especially since Hashirama-kun wasn't always a man that would quickly realize what I meant with my early efforts." I blinked. "You think that dash? Madara needs time and attention to refine his methods if he is serious about that. While it's fine to meddle while he is so silly with his antics, I wish for you to realize that your mama is an adult that can judge and choose for herself," the redhead brought up. "So trust your mama's judgment, just like you trust your Auntie Mito's decision to invite you to this family gathering." I didn't answer to that, merely nodding as I conceded defeat at that unbreakable defense. With that topic solved, my attention turned elsewhere. Now that I thought about it, this was going to be my first interaction I had with the Uzumaki clan where I had no proper foreknowledge of these people. I was going to delve in some mysterious waters, and this was indeed concerning. Despite this unpleasant feeling, I was having trouble shrugging off the uneasiness off as I expected this to be a chaotic but overall good family reunion. It's the Uzumaki family. Surely they were going to be all friendly and sympathetic. I was partly wrong with that silly assumption. While it was correct to think of the Uzumaki clan as a family-centered group that were quick to integrate new individuals among their ranks, the little expectation that I had over the envoy was easily subverted when I had the chance of meeting Yoshiko-chan. Hiruzen was as clueless as I was when we were first introduced to the Uzumaki entourage. Ryuji Uzumaki, the Uzukage, proved to be Naruto's ancestor when the first thing he did was rush up to his sister to give her a tight hug. Mito giggled at the affectionate approach, and Hashirama was legitimately frightened when his brother-in-law saw it fit to give him some not-so-subtle threats about what would have happened if he failed to make sure their princess was taken care properly during her delicate phase. The fact he also added "you better believe it" at the end of his final threat made me realize that I was never going to hear things like databeo, or databesa, or any other nervousness-induced catchphrase that seemed common in the clan. But while that was a relief since I wasn't planning to get tortured by decades of that stuff, I was also aware that I was going to hear similar sentences to the catchphrases. And I was going to hate each and every moment of that blasted development. Still, the current issue took priority over my annoyance as I ended up making first contact with a grade 8 tsundere. One can joke about this kind of encounter, but when these happened, things were quick to get bad. Especially when said tsundere was a self-proclaimed high-tier kunoichi with a superiority complex aimed at us. Yoshiko was 7, and while being a brat was fine in most occasions, the brattiness she was quick to display was enough to get me to groan already. The girl looked like a mini Kushina with a darker shade of red hair and a pair of dark violet eyes. Her hair was a little clearer compared to this example, but that was hardly a defining feature since her personality was doing all the work for her to bring me to a state of incredible irritation. My companion in this dreadful lunch proved to be less inclined to directly address the matter as he tried his best to ignore and be ignored. The thing was that ignoring someone was never within the intentions of a standard tsundere, and the moment we were led to another room while the adults started to talk about serious villages-related matters, Yoshiko employed her full arrogance against us. Sitting on some pillows, I was trying my best to keep my attention locked onto my friend when a shadow loomed over us. "So, Auntie Mito said that you two were training to become ninjas," the girl muttered with a mocking tone. "I bet you two can't even handle shuriken properly." "We can, Yoshiko-san," I replied with a dry voice. "As if I would ever believe any lies coming from your mouth, Dakuen." My lips twitched in clear annoyance, but it wasn't the comment itself that got me this irked. It was the way this brat had taken a liking in addressing me as Dakuen. Why the hell was this becoming a thing? Why the hell Mito thought this to be a good idea? These questions I really wanted an answer about, but I wasn't going to risk my safety by bringing those up to the only individual that could answer those. I preferred life to death. I didn't continue through that conversation. With politeness failing to at least dilute the effects of her bitchiness, I just leaned back and turned away from the smug-looking Uzumaki. I allowed her this empty victory, just for the sake of me holding back from getting a more practical one against her. With me dealt with, her next target was Hiruzen. The brunette tried to look away and follow my example, but this only fueled the interest of the tsundere to press her advantage. "Your father, he is Sasuke Sarutobi," she hummed in malicious mirthfulness. "I bet he knows that you're actually a crybaby." The insult was weak, and considering the training we had to go through, Hiruzen was hardly fazed by it. Learning from my recent mistake, he decided against giving a proper response to that, merely keeping himself quiet after that comment. Yoshiko was irritated by the lack of a reply. That was one of the weaknesses to the bravado she was displaying. Considering how arrogant she was, I knew that while her training was above average, she was far from being a genuine threat to either me or Hiruzen. Which is why I was paying her little to no attention whatsoever as she seemed to contemplate this strange retaliation. Silence reigned as dominus, and for a moment I thought that we had indeed found a way to drive her to stay quiet. Once again a silly illusion that was proven wrong when she decided to aim higher and strike harder. "But I bet it has to be tougher for Dakuen since he only has his mommy," the girl resumed, her maliciousness barely grazing at my mind's thick armor. Always crying for daddy that is never coming home. A nobody, someone that probably died in a ditch and dash. And that's enough, I muttered as I stood up from my seat. The action got a surprised look from the cheeky brat, and her wide eyes were matched with my stern look. I was no longer beneath her, and the sudden closeness got a shiver out of her and a quick step back. You think you can just insult us because your father is important? I asked with an irked tone. That you can come here and demand respect when you're so eagerly mocking the passing of people that died in the past age of wars? A scowl slowly appeared on her face, but she didn't have anything to say back at me. You're all talk and no bite. That's the truth, I continued calmly, my stare never leaving her. And if you think I will just allow you to disrespect my father like this, then you are incredibly wrong. Narrowing her eyes at me, she tried to reply. Really? Then prove it. Prove that you're not some crybaby that Auntie Mito took pity upon. To be fair, it was Madara that took pity, but then again, why was I the one that needed to prove something? I wasn't the one prancing around talking of being some amazing ninja or stuff like that. I have class, and I definitely wouldn't want my enemies to know how amazing I am. Despite my initial interest in pointing these mistakes out, I decided to follow up the threat with one of my own. Fine by me. The mansion has a training courtyard that I'm sure we can use. She scoffed. Of course we can, this is Uncle and Aunt's house, and they would allow me to have you humiliated. I didn't hate kids, in fact I mostly saw them as cute and adorable in most instances. But Yoshiko was making me regret having such a soft-hearted approach towards children. I was quite sure that after today my perception of my peers was going to change a lot. Instead of lingering any further on those thoughts, Hiruzen and I led the girl to where the courtyard was and we started to set up the rules of this stupid challenge. Shuriken Jutsu, and a display of our best jutsus. I was more than glad that I had recovered enough chakra to use a technique without straining my body, but what really made me ecstatic was when the first task started. Yoshiko took the first turn, throwing 3 kunais at the central target and getting all of them on the middle spot of the target. Her gloating smile was partly legitimate, and she looked surprised as I decided to clap at her successful display. If only I had been more mindful of the fact that this kind of praise only aggravated her kind of people. Yes, I was aware of that a few moments before going through with it. Which is why I still did that. As I ignored her furious stare, I took 4 shurikens on each hand, allowing the sharp projectiles on the openings between my fingers as I took aim and threw them at the 3 targets all at once. The lateral targets had 2 shurikens each stabbed onto their middle spot as closely as possible, while the remaining 4 had been embedded onto the central spot of the target directly in front of me. Hiruzen clapped at the performance, while Yoshiko's jaws dropped very low at the unexpected results. While I had given priority to techniques and chakra reinforcement, I still left some space to sharpen my shuriken jutsu to an impressive degree of precision. I was a ninja first and foremost, so abilities that revolved around subtlety were to be improved to the very best. With the first half of the challenge concluded in my victory, the next bit proved to be somewhat bizarre considering that I was expecting something flashy from the red-haired girl. I really was. And yet, as she took a few steps toward one of the main pillars of the room, the girl smiled smugly, before starting to walk up onto it. I blinked, unimpressed by the fact she was using a simple chakra control technique and not a proper ninjutsu, but I still looked at her as she walked up to the upper section of the ceiling. Ah! I bet you can't do this! Yoshiko exclaimed victoriously, happily preparing to descend and expect a failure from me. But as she walked back to the pillar, her left foot slipped and she almost fell down off the ceiling. Panic surged within my brain as I saw her arms moving just in time by wrapping around the piece of ceiling she had been standing off. Her legs were waving in fright and she looked fairly desperate. Help! I can't dash. I glanced at Hiruzen, the brunette providing me a concerned look, but I quickly calmed him down by giving him a simple nod before I walked up to the pillar and started to climb it up. The young Uzumaki looked incredibly afraid as she held as much as she could onto the wood, the piece groaning and slightly bending at the sudden weight. Reaching the height she was struggling by, I carefully leaned towards her and started to help her move towards me. She continued to flail, but her desperation had calmed down a little bit as she took notice of my presence. Finally, she wrapped her arms around my neck as tightly as she could, burying her face on my shoulder as I quietly started the descent procedure. Moments passed silently even as we reached the floor, and her desperate embrace continued despite the fact we were no longer in a dangerous situation. "Yoshiko," I said, trying to sound as polite as possible. "Can you please dash?" I paused, a muffled sob reaching my ears and forcing me to address the fact that she didn't look particularly fine. And I guess it's pretty normal since she was a kid. And so was I. And Hiruzen. How the heck is it possible that young Sarutobi wasn't fazed by this circumstance? I had the self-insert card to play. What about him? Ninja parents? He is Sasuke Sarutobi's son after all. Just as I tried to pry her off, and hopefully calm her down with some proper words, my attention was stolen away as I noticed someone rushing towards us. I was yanked away without having the chance of saying anything, my butt hurting as I landed a few meters away on the cold wooden floor. The Uchiha was embracing her daughter as tightly as possible, and the little girl, albeit surprised by this curious event, didn't shy away from returning the hug. I could see Mito gasping and rushing toward me while the Hokage kept by Hiruzen's side and started to speak with him. "My sweet Yo-chan, what happened? Why was that boy hugging you and dash?" "Daddy," the child muttered nervously, but before she had the chance to continue, the man turned to me with the most furious look on his face. "What did you do to my baby girl, boy?" I opened my mouth. "Stop yelling at the children, Ryuji," Mito remarked sternly. "I want to know the truth myself, but you can't behave like this." The Uchiha seemed ready to retort this, but he stopped as soon as he felt his daughter tugging at his coat. It's my fault, Daddy," Yoshiko pointed out quietly. I tried to climb up that pillar and I got stuck." "Did Dakun help you back down, Yo-chan?" Mito inquired, getting a nod from her niece. "Then I think you owe Dakun an apology, Ryuji." The man tensed up, looking unhappy about the situation. He glanced at me, and I gave him a deadpan glance. He was also embarrassed from the way he quickly looked away at my intense gaze. "Apologies, kid." I would have wanted a lengthier apology, but then the situation would have become awkward once more and I really wanted to get done with this predicament. The visit didn't continue for long, and in the end I accepted the meek apology from Yoshiko when she later decided to talk with me in private. Hiruzen and I were finally allowed to go back home, and I expected for this entire debacle to be settled with the envoy leaving by the end of the day. But when the next morning struck, and I was woken up by my mother as she asked for me to check at the front door as a cute visitor was waiting there for me, I found myself gawking at the giggling form of an issue I had expected gone with the end of the previous night. "Good morning, Danzo-kun. Do you mind if I join you for breakfast?" Turns out that Mito made a compelling point with the Uchiha to let his daughter stay for a couple of months, just for the sake of providing some training while also fostering the relations between Konoha and Uchiha. Once again, these were going to be a couple of dreadful and long months. Chapter 6, Peace by Power, 1. 2 simple weeks went by ever since Yoshiko was allowed to stay in Konoha, and my life had taken a drastic turn towards a particularly unpleasant direction. While many would shrug my plight as the struggle of a child trying to stay away from any girls with cooties, the reality was a little more about a grown-up dilemma. Even as I keep trying to politely decline the aggressive friendship-based attempts of a redhead with massive chakra reserves and plenty of techniques to give me chase around the village, the fact that nobody was offering me some legitimate support on the matter was infuriating. Sure, I was little Danzo, but the mind and soul behind the kid's body was one of an adult. The idea of me being one of the 2 kids that were parried by some women just because we were cute together was as chilling as disgusting. I really didn't have much against Yoshiko. She didn't know that her crush was way older than he looked to be, and she was a kid. And kids of her age have yet to develop the proper means to understand the intricate thing that is love. Which is why I considered her pseudo-stalking kind of cute to a fair point, as I could play around with it by going for smart but hilarious ways to screw with her covers. But as funny as it was, there was no denying that it was also immensely annoying whenever I was busy training. She would be perched by one of the trees, merely watching and doing nothing else. Nothing that could allude to her eventually turning into Yandere just yet, and I was quite sure that the Uzumaki had not gone for the Hinata pattern just yet. My hopes were grand, and I sure wasn't going to allow for anything less than that. I really wasn't planning to create a Yandere by being the nice guy of the situation. But the compelling question now is, Danzo-kun, why are you still considering the development a terrible thing if Yoshiko is that manageable? Well, my dear imagined friend, for this specific example, while Yoshiko wasn't that horrible, the same wasn't for the adults that were cheering for something cute to happen out of this. Mito was the one that spearheaded this, and my own mother had been more than happy to invite the girl for lunch from time to time. The discussions during these events were tame, but the shy blushing and the safe questions used by the girl were hints that the redhead knew that going overboard with her interest was going to end poorly for her. Hiruzen was mostly neutral about the matter. The brunette wasn't that much surprised that this happened by his own words, and he quickly explained that his father ended up marrying his mother in a similar manner. My next attempt to gain solace was through Kagami, but he was still ignoring me for the fact I had used him as a training target. Well, it's not my fault that mastering the Earth-style technique in my arsenal required a moving enemy to use it on. Just as I had predicted, Yoshiko was also enrolled in the academy, and the first steps of chaos were quick to appear during the first day. The young Uzumaki was by no means a troublemaker, but when she ended up targeted by some girls, Yoshiko showed an efficiency in quickly dealing with the bullies that was unexpected. Lord Hokage was still called to answer about this event, but the situation eventually ended with a minor settlement that slightly favored the girl, as she was recognized as the victim of the attack that used self-defense. And with that mere act, the redhead ended up gathering a following that was awed at the might of the princess from Uzumaki. Nobody knew that Yoshiko was the Uchiha's daughter, which made the title fairly amusing to listen to from time to time. And with the girl slowly gaining a degree of presence wherever I was, the only moment I genuinely saw some freedom was when Madara began taking me out of the village for small patrols around the forest. Nothing truly dangerous, especially since I would stick around the Uchiha during the whole trip. Conversations would ensue from time to time, but nothing really meaningful considering how much attention was needed on speed and direction. We weren't even going that far from the walls, and the nature beyond civilization was somewhat relaxing. The patrols were something that had been pushed by Hashirama to give Madara some time away from the village whenever the head of the clan felt the need to stay away from the crowds of people in Konoha. I would have expected the man to make a fuss about being pushed to deal with something this menial and boring, but I was mostly surprised when he said he had been the one asking for a way out from dealing with his own clan. While the lore saw Madara as the absolute controller of the Uchiha clan, the truth was slightly different considering the noticeable influence exerted by the elders with the family. The group of old men had been supporting my teacher for several years now, but one of their main concerns had started to grow frustrating and unnerving to Madara himself. They wanted for an heir to be produced. They needed proof that their leader was ready to father an offspring and continue the long line that had governed the family from the Warring States period to the creation of Konoha. In the original timeline, this concern was pretty much ignored since Madara was aiming at the Hokage's role first, relegating the rest of his duties to secondary dates. With my meddling, this situation was subverted, and I slowly realized that the one that was to blame for throwing my sensei into trying to court my mother was none other than myself. Fuck! I had already screwed myself over and I hadn't realized that until now. Despite the grim thought that I was the idiot behind this very annoyance, I still found the discussion noteworthy as it gave me more insight over the politics of the Uchiha. The idea that there was so much more that I had yet to learn about this nice but somewhat deadly village was regarded with a degree of hopefulness. I really didn't want to die by ignoring a possible danger. Speaking of possible dangers, the conclusion of the second week saw me dealing with another situation that not only I hadn't expected to deal with, but also I was surprised to see unfold in the most bizarre of manners. It all started by the afternoon. School day was over, I had already eaten my lunch, and I was making my way to the training ground to meet up with Madara. It was pretty standard, and I was glad that Yoshiko had been busy because of her homework. Despite her interest in me, she was still unable to refuse her aunt's stern reminders that studying was more important. I was in a good mood, and I could already feel that something was indeed off about today. Starting with the Hokage pacing around the academy's building for some unknown reason, and then Mito being seen using her chains by one of the unused classrooms while her husband watched. Their respective attitudes just had something that I couldn't help but worry about. They were concerned themselves, and they were preparing for something. But what? And why? I couldn't remember anything that should worry the strong couple. The first Kage Summit was still a far possibility, and that was the biggest event I could remember that was going to happen in the next couple of months. So what was I missing? The answer came in the form of a serious-looking Madara enlisting me for another patrol, this time a little further than the areas that we usually checked by. I was surprised by his tense voice and lack of arrogance, but I knew to not refuse the request as I knew that nothing bad was meant to happen to me. Or so I expected this to be the case. Worries of this being a flag about him bailing from Konoha were taken with a cautious approach, especially since I knew this possibility wasn't as doable as it was in the original timeline. Trusting my instincts that this was just the usual patrol session, I proceeded to follow my teacher out of Konoha's gates and deep in the green forest that spread on the right side of the entrance. We were going fast and far, with my mind building up thoughts and theories about what was going on. Some foreign ninja was trying to go for a border clash? Bandits? Maybe something sillier than that? Nothing was spared in that solo brainstorming, but I could still feel like I was missing something important. Something about the context of the situation. Eventually we arrived at our destination, with Madara stopping and gesturing me to stand on the tree branch I had just landed. The wood creaked, but it survived my weight as the two of us started to wait. There was silence and quiet, and the chances of this being a convoy of raiders from another village passing by started to grow more concrete within my mind. I was so sure of it, there was no other way possible. But I had forgotten that shock and awe were the major key of grand events. Especially those that history books and the original timeline might have forgotten about. While my eyes were on the road nearby, my attention slowly left my attentive gazing over the muddy line dividing the forest in two and started to shift to the small vibrations making the tree I was standing on shake. It wasn't an earthquake as the vibration wasn't a prolonged one. No, there was something unnatural about this phenomenon. It continued to grow in its intensity, and soon my mind connected dots about possible culprits for this predicament. Something was approaching. And it had to be quite big for making the earth shake so much. We waited, my tension increasing as I started to see a shadow in the patch of trees over the main road and several meters away from us. It was humongous, with several tendrils spreading from its behind nine tails. You gotta be kidding me! Why were we here? Why was I here? I was hardly capable of holding a fight with a high-tier genin, so how does my presence make things easy for Madara to handle? The Kyuubi, it was here. It shouldn't be there as there was no mention of the tailed beast ever coming to Konoha before Hashirama decided to have it sealed away. So why? Why was it here? While I would have wanted to ask as quickly as I realized this dreadful situation, my lips were sealed shut as I was finally hit by the passive aura of hatred coming off the Kyuubi. The miasma was manageable, but I could feel my chest tightening over the unpleasant setting I had been thrown into. Is that the dash? Kyuubi no Yuko, Madara curtly confirmed. Scouts had spotted it making a straight line towards Konoha. It isn't the first time this happens, but it never came this close to the village until today. And that was bad. Like, could it be that Hashirama and Madara actually fought the beast before the Uchiha had betrayed the village? How much of the lore did I need to study before I was certain of every historical aspect of this era? Still, while I was lost in my musing, I started to realize that maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to make a dangerous move against any enemy interested in the tailed beasts. Technically speaking, if I tried to stop the Kyuubi head-on, I knew that I was going to die a quick death. But if I tried something a little unorthodox and partially dumb, I was sure I could have swayed some interesting chance out of this unusual event. Plus, why wouldn't I want to capture an overgrown Vulpix? Sensei, I don't want to sound foolish dash. Then don't speak at all. The quick denial got a flinch out of me. That degree of sternness was a novelty, but I knew that it was legitimate since the monster we were looking at was capable of swatting high-tier ninjas around as if those were flies. The only ones that could currently handle him were Madara, through his Manjikyu Sharingan, Hashirama, through his Mokuton, and Mito, with her golden chains and sealing mastery. And I clearly was far from being as powerful as they were considering the circumstances. But I had a degree of leverage over the big fox. Knowledge that would not only have him pause in his pursuit of food and human extermination, but also get him to become my ally. Sensei dash. Enough. We will return to Konoha and dash. I can stop it. He narrowed my eyes at me. Perhaps you're not thinking straight. Maybe I should have expected the hateful aura coming from it influencing you, but dash. I'm quite sure the worst influence I was dealing with was the tiredness of going through a painstakingly slow school day. That could hardly be beaten by anything. Instead of speaking once again, I knew that it was time to make a decision that could easily put an end to the youthful adventures of Danzo if I wasn't careful enough with my approach. I could see gold, and now I couldn't help but jump towards the shiny pot. And like that, I bolted off the tree branch and up for the sky. I went well above the trees, and soon I was in sight to reach my target. The Kyuubi had barely noticed my presence, perhaps deciding that I wasn't worthy of his attention. Soon I found myself right above the spot I wanted to land on and quickly dive-bombed for my destination. The hateful aura intensified the more I got closer to the origin of it, and I was about to start shivering uncontrollably before I found peace within the fluffy landing spot I had eyed from my previous position. The fox stopped, the behemoth pausing as Kurama realized that the little issue was slightly bigger than he had expected. I didn't linger on the soft fur of his, knowing that if I didn't move now I was going to be swatted and probably erased by one of his tails. My walk through the tailed beast's back was a tense but speedy one, and I ultimately arrived at his right shoulder before taking a seat in there. The Kyuubi tilted his head so that one of his red-slitted eyes could take note of my presence. A human kit? Are you perhaps suicidal? I've been asked that an unhealthy amount of times, but no, I'm not craving death. A blink, then two. Then why are you annoying me if you aren't seeking death, little mortal? Oh, just passing by and admiring nature, plus I think you're going toward a place I don't want you to trash and destroy. Your home? Maybe. Oh, so you're from that village. I think you humans call it Konoha? Maybe. His posture tensed and a little snarl replaced the neutral take from his lips. And now you're irking me. It's not my fault you learned to like hate more than love, I pointed out dryly. Nor I think it's yours. Now, isn't that a curious thing to say? The beast mused out loud. You speak as if you know me. I shrugged. I've heard about you. And your backstory. A lie to spare your pathetic settlement? Nah, I'm quite sure of the info I've on you, I replied calmly, fighting off the little uneasiness that was returning despite the softening of his hateful aura. I think you're a little kid that doesn't know anything about the world. Are you comparing me to your younger self, Kurama? He was ready to rebuke at that little jab, but he paused as he realized what I had just said. We were pretty far from where Madara was, and I was speaking as quietly as I was allowed without passing to whispering. There was silence, with the fox thinking about my words before offering the best he could come up after a solid minute of quiet. How? I know stuff. But people don't know I know, I tried to explain as shortly as I could. I know that your father, the sage, created you from the Jubi and he wanted you to guide humanity through the right path, but we messed things up. I would say you tarnished, crapped and then barfed over his legacy. I shrugged again. I mean, kinda? I don't want to say I don't give much weight to the gravity of the situation, but you're right about it. I can tell there is a but. Speak up, I'm feeling interested. I want to make a deal. Consider it more of a temporary solution so we can come up with a proper apology for the shit you and your siblings had to go through. The fox huffed, easing up a little bit. And that is? I merely smiled. Yep, I just got my overgrown Vulpix. Forgive me if I'm sounding a little bit insensitive, Danzo-kun, but what do you mean you offered the Kyubi the mountain over the village as a resting ground? I flinched at the loud tone taken by the Hokage. The office was significantly packed with important ninjas. Sasuke, Sarutobi, Madara, Tobirama, Mito, Hashirama. Yep, I think I managed to make this a fun grilling to be subjected to. Do you understand the danger you've subjected yourself and Konoha to? The possibility of the fox just abusing this deal to attack us by surprise. Yes, because the currently napping fox that was visible from the window behind him would certainly strike the village, with yawns. I'm being serious. And I know that my decision isn't driven by stupidity, I rebuked tensely, gaining a frown from Hashirama. But before the Hokage had the chance to inquire about my sureness, Mito decided to speak up. Dakun, I want you to answer this question without omitting any truth you might know of, the woman began saying with a serious tone. Can you guarantee that the Kyubi will not attack Konoha? I can guarantee it with my life, I stated with a calm tone, drawing some perplexed looks at the degree of seriousness I was displaying for someone of my age. I have two details that cement this belief of mine. Hashirama sighed, shaking his head at the maddening situation I had brought to the village. And those are? I know its name and its purpose. The Hokage frowned at the response. And those are? The Kyubi's name is Kurama. And it was created by. I think the book my dad showed me said something about a sage. The sage of the six paths, Hashirama offered, and I nodded in faux realization. Why yeah. This sage created the tailed beasts to guide humanity through the right path, to lead everyone towards peace. And yet the Kyubi is known for being a creature born from hatred, Tobirama opposed with a confused tone. Why would the sage create a being of that composition and nature? Maybe because Kurama isn't made by hatred? Hiruzen's father proposed. And this got a curious look from the Hokage's brother, surprised that the head of the Sarutobi clan was contemplating my words. You mean that the accounts about its attacks were false? Not truly, the brunette answered. I think that while the attacks were indeed true, the reason that drove the Kyubi to strike at humans weren't born from instinct. He was attacked first, Mito muttered quietly. And it wouldn't be the first time we see fear and misunderstanding driving attacks and wars against us. Differently from the canon's time when the people started to regard the Kyubi in a more positive light, it was easier now to do so by comparing its existence to what had been the time period that had just come to an end. People were still weary about it, and many could still remember that most of these conflicts were driven by stupid reasons that hardly materialized by the end of each war. I gave them what they needed to hear, and now it was up to them to make their own mind about the situation. Despite my knowledge, I wasn't going to screw my cover for the sake of protecting this decision. I needed to have my interrogators do that for me. Or else I was going to risk a little more than a stern lecture. You should also tell them about the points you've agreed with the Kyubi. Madara decided to pull me back in the conversation, perhaps interested to see how I would handle being pressured again. The smug bastard was going to feel my wrath once I got some laxatives in his ramen when we would have lunch at my house tomorrow. Points? I gulped nervously as Hashirama inquired, and I knew that one of the individuals in there was going to be annoyed by what I had agreed with Kurama. Considering that Kurama isn't a tool nor a weapon for Konoha to use whenever there is a war, I started to say with a tense voice. We've agreed that he will only defend the village and not attack targets outside Konoha's proximity. Tobirama tensed up at this. You mean that he will not dash? He isn't a toy for anyone to use, I pressed nervously. And yet it would favor the village immensely, Madara rebuked calmly. Still, I can see that convincing the fox would be too difficult, especially since it would be like imposing our will upon him. Tobirama sighed tiredly. And that would mean losing the advantage altogether. I suppose we couldn't have asked for more without jeopardizing this undoubtable boon to the village. I can tell that now we've reached a conclusion to this little meeting, and I think I have the proper punishment for Dakuen, Mito proclaimed calmly, turning at me with a smile of the sickly sweet kind. A chill went down my spine while the rest of the ninjas present nodded in agreement, allowing the redhead to speak up about the matter. While Dakuen gave the village an addition that will improve our defenses, I believe that he put himself at a risk that could have seen him lose his life, the Uzumaki resumed calmly. Which is why I think the best way to help him understand the error of his way is by having him spend the 3 full weeks as an assistant to aid me during my activities. He will start his shift once he is done with lunch and his homework, and he will be done by the time of dinner. At first I didn't see anything bad with that punishment, but then I realized that I was going to be forced to stay even closer to Yoshiko than I planned. What about Dash? I can invite your mama whenever she is free and you need her. I don't want you to miss her after all, Dakuen. And cue the babying from the pregnant woman. God damn it. Also, the redhead added happily. I would like to make a suggestion about Madara's own punishment. The Uchiha frowned. My what? Weren't you close enough to prevent Dakuen from going for that act? Yes, but Dash. Then I think you will do well by replacing Tobirama for 3 weeks and aiding Hashirama-kun with the paperwork. The Hokage paled a little bit, while his younger brother took the news with a frown. And what am I supposed to do about it? Don't you have projects beyond your work here with your brother? The Uzumaki inquired calmly. Yes, Dash. Then you have the answers to that question already. Despite my attempt to limit the damage I was meant to take at that brash decision, I could tell that the hand life had just given to me wasn't one to chuckle at. I could already imagine the kind of games Mito was going to push both Yoshiko and I to do during my time at the Hokage's mansion. And I sure was going to regret my stay there, as one of the few win-loss situations I would end up facing in my long and hopefully uncrippled life. That's the end of this tale for now. If you enjoyed, like the video. And subscribe if you'd like to see more of this. Comment down below your thoughts, and with that being said, check out my other stories here, and peace.